A couple of weeks ago, the Jewish journalist, MAGA Marxist Batya Ungar went viral on X because she claimed, and I quote, Jews have been at the forefront of every liberal and leftist issue in America.
According to John Fetterman himself, his Zionism puts him out of step with the rest of his party, which, I'm sorry, only 13% stand with Israelis against the Palestinians. This is a party whose grassroots is right now captured by the left. And so Zionism does not have a future in the American left. The Democratic Party's relationship with Zionism depends on whether it's willing to repudiate that far left. And the thing that makes this so appalling is that Jews built the left in this country. We built the labor movement. We broke the New Deal. 70% of the lawyers who worked on civil rights cases were Jews. We've been at the forefront of every liberal and leftist issue in this country. The absolute chutzpah of saying, you're not welcome here. You know what it reminds me of? When they banned smoking in bars. I was a smoker, and I was so outraged. I was like, if there's gonna be a turf war over this, surely the smokers should have gotten the bars, okay? And you can so easily imagine a counterfactual in which the left in America said, wait a minute. We can't oppose Zionism because we would lose our beloved Jews who have been there with us at the forefront every minute that we built this movement. We have to find a way to make sure that Zionists still feel welcome. We could never do that to them. And they didn't do that. They did the opposite.
It's clear Batya is frustrated because she, as a Jewish leftist, feels a sense of ownership over the Democratic Party and the broader anti-capitalist left. She is anti-woke in the sense that she thinks identity politics is a distraction from improving the material conditions of the American people, and she takes a very broad definition of who constitutes an American and bases it purely on documentation and citizenship rather than ancestry or religion. And I thought that because this channel is interested in exploring the intersections of how foreign and imported cultures interact with indigenous European and American culture under the rubric of multiculturalism and the political problems that throws up, we should examine her claim. But I realise this is a complete third rail to touch, and I will doubtless, when this video goes live, get messages from Jewish friends who agree with me that Jews who are involved in leftist movements are ultimately, as Renaud Camus once told the Parisian Jewish Forum, soaring off the branch upon which they sit. However, the reason that I'm doing this is because Jewish groups do exist where Jews, left and right alike, come together to speak to one another as Jews, even if they don't share religion, whether they are secular or observant, whether they're Reform or Orthodox, whether they are Marxists or MAGA, or even consider themselves both at the same time. And so, if they are concerned about anti-Semitism resulting from a discussion of these issues, I would say that places like the Board of Deputies in Britain, or the World Jewish Leadership Summit that just met to have a kind of crisis meeting to discuss Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson doing an interview, they should be addressing these issues, the root causes of why people are having a discussion about the overrepresentation of Jews in progressive movements, if there is such a pattern, rather than talking about the second-order effects, as Douglas Murray would say, which are conversations about the overrepresentations of Jews in those movements. So, let's examine Batya's claim. And I want to be clear, for anyone who has seen my exchange with Batya Ungar earlier this year, I don't think Batya is representative of all that many Jews, especially those who consider themselves members of MAGA or on the Western right, because she believes that the West is constituted by a Judeo-Christian Muslim worldview, and there are lots of Jews who consider themselves on the right who are very critical of the Muslim part.
Having a First Amendment is being used to justify saying some actually hateful things. Now, I think hate speech in my country is protected speech. But to question whether citizens of your country are incompatible with the values of your country because of their faith is disgusting. How I would define wokeness is, it's when you take a worldview that should be based on right versus wrong. The Judeo-Christian Muslim worldview that says that there is virtue and there is vice. There are good things and there are bad things, and people should strive to do good and strive to be good.
However, as you can see by that clip, Bhatia does demonstrate a double standard, which I think is represented by Jewish members of both the left and the right. Not all, again, not every ethnic group is a monolith. However, the belief that every group except indigenous white European, English, and heritage American populations can collectively organize and advocate for their interests on the lines of their identity. For example, Bhatia is advocating for Jewish identity politics because she says that Jews are central to the left, Israel is essential to secure the future of Jews as a diaspora and as a demographic majority in their own country, and therefore Zionism is Jewish identity politics, collective bargaining on behalf of Jews in their political interest. We also have on the right in both Britain and America, in the Conservatives and the Republicans, Indian identity politics, with the H-1B visa issue, with Dinesh D'Souza and Vivek Ramaswamy instinctively setting themselves against heritage American culture to take the side of Indian diasporas, and in the UK, Priti Patel agitating for more Indian immigrants to come over as living bridges. And then on the left, you have anti-white identity politics practiced by every aggrieved imported minority group, Muslims, and unorthodox sexual identities in the Rainbow Coalition. And the compounding problem is that people on the right will often ally with leftists they claim to hate, anti-white leftists, to attack other people on the right, to their right, who do say, if every group can play identity politics, why can't heritage Americans, why can't English people, why can't indigenous Europeans also organise as a political community and bargain for their interests? Because if you've disrupted the pre-political we, Roger Scruton's term, for the community who have to agree on an identity before they press for political issues and political representation, if you've disrupted that with mass immigration, civic nationalist, blank slate, liberal versions of citizenship, and then you introduce vitriolic anti-white and sexual identity politics into that mixture, then you've not just broken apart the settled identity, but you've made it subordinate to every other identity in the country that belongs to that identity. And so, of course, the natural reaction is if every other group is organising along group lines, then we may as well organise for our own group, but that's the only group that's told they can't organise along those lines, and the people on their own side, the right, will often ally with the left to get them censored, cancelled, shunned from polite society. So there is a double standard here that is being maintained by Bhatia's position, and I think the position of other figures, many of whom are Jewish, on both the right and left, that cannot be sustained. And so it is in the interest of those Jewish groups to address that if they want to decrease anti-Semitism. But, prescriptions aside, is her claim correct? Did Jews build every liberal and leftist issue in America? Is the following post correct by the Reverend Jordan Wells, who appears to be a Zionist black pastor in America, that the civil rights movement, as we know it, would have died in the cradle without Jewish Americans? This was posted more recently than Bhatia's video. This was posted last week, in November. Bhatia's video was released late in October. He says Jews co-founded the NAACP in 1909. Jewish money kept the lights on, sometimes over 50% of the budget. Jewish lawyers stood shoulder to shoulder with black lawyers in every major case, from Brown v. Board of Education to the Montgomery bus boycott. They didn't just help, they bled, marched, and got arrested, and wrote the checks when most white Americans wanted us both gone. So when I see people online spewing Jews are the enemy, I remember who had our back when literally nobody else did. As you can see here, they're playing identity politics in pursuit of egalitarian ends, and lots of people who have noticed this pattern, who have been accused of being conspiracy theorists, anti-Semites, white supremacists, when they have said there is an overrepresentation of Jews in progressive politics, they're getting deja vu of when the left would have the "it's not happening, but it's a good thing" gaslighting tactic, where if you point it out, then it's a sin, it's a conspiracy theory, it's immoral. But if they point it out and celebrate it, then that's allowed. Let's explore this claim starting with the civil rights movement. And to be clear, in this video, I'm going to use majority Jewish sources so that I can neither be accused of nor accidentally fall into the trap of laundering narratives that are perpetuated purely out of ethnic hatred for Jewish people. Because I don't think you could accuse Jews of doing that, just as you can't accuse Batya of spreading white supremacist conspiracy theories when she laments how she feels Jews have turned on the left because she believes that Jews built the left. So going to reformjudaism.org, and I understand there are differences between Orthodox and Reform Judaism, and we'll actually bring that up later when we explore the reasons why this might have actually happened. But answering the question, what role have Jews played historically in the civil rights movement? They say, Jews in the United States have a long and proud history of advocating on behalf of others. Our own history has taught us about the importance of respecting the fundamental rights of people. In particular, Jews have played an important role in championing the rights of African Americans, Black Americans. Kaiv Kaplan, a vice chairman of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now the Union for Reform Judaism, served as the national president of the NAACP from 1966 to 1975. Jews made up half of the young people who participated in the Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964. Reformed Jewish leaders were arrested, with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in St. Augustine, Florida in 1964 after a challenge to racial segregation in public accommodations. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were drafted in the conference room of the Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism, under the aegis of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which for decades was located in the same building. In the summer of 2015, the Reformed Jewish community participated in the NAACP's Journey for Justice, led by the efforts of Rabbi Seth Limmer and Chicago Sinai Congregation. Nearly 200 Reformed Jewish activists, most of them rabbis, joined the NAACP in a historic 860-mile march from Selma to Washington, D.C., carrying a Torah on foot the entire way. Together they marched to advance a national agenda that protects the right of every American to a fair criminal justice system, uncorrupted and unfettered access to the ballot box, sustainable jobs with a living wage, and equitable public education. So this is a Reformed Jewish organization saying Jewish activists, rabbis, were inextricable from the process of drafting the Civil Rights Act, from its protest movements that manufactured consent for getting it over the line, and they championed things like Lyndon B. Johnson's welfare reforms and ongoing efforts to liberalize the criminal justice system in pursuit of racial equity, in pursuit of ensuring equal outcomes between Black Americans and white Americans. Again, not representative of all Jewish thought, but this is a strain of Judaism that is involved in progressive social movements, starting with the civil rights movement. My Jewish Learning provides more details on the Jews involved in the civil rights movement. Regarding the NAACP, it says in 1914, Professor Emeritus Joel Spingarn of Columbia University became the chairman of the NAACP and recruited for its board such Jewish leaders as Jacob Schiff, Jacob Bilikoff, and Rabbi Stephen Weiss. No wonder Batya Ungar is so upset about the pro-Palestine protests on the campus of Columbia University, if it is the epicenter of Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. Jews were also the earliest supporters of the Urban League, founded in New York in 1911, to help newly arrived Black migrants from the rural South, probably because they identified themselves as immigrants, and so they saw the exile of blacks from the South akin to their own exile from Egypt and their own exile from Europe in the Middle Ages and their own migration to America. So they had empathy from their experiences as a migrant people. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers took the lead in organizing Our Black Brothers for union membership over the opposition of the American Federation of Labor National Board. So they are attempting to form labor movements to advocate for progressive policies against the existing labor movements that were dominated by white Americans at the time. And in the climactic civil rights drives of the 1950s and 1960s, Jewish participation was all but overwhelming. In the landmark 1954 Brown v. Board of Education ruling itself, the Supreme Court accepted the research of the black sociologist Kenneth Clark that segregation placed the stamp of inferiority on black children. Clark's study had been commissioned by the American Jewish Committee, and it appeared in the amicus curiae brief the committee submitted to the court. The Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Congress also submitted amicus curiae briefs in behalf behalf of the cause. Once the judgment was issued, these Jewish defense organizations continued to file legal briefs in civil rights cases dealing with housing, employment, education, and public accommodation. Many local and state desegregation regulations were actually drafted in the offices of the Jewish agencies. So, when Batya claims that a large number of civil rights lawyers, civil rights activists, and labor union members were Jewish, she is correct. And both she and My Jewish Learning are saying that this is a good thing. So to observe it, without putting any moral valence on it, saying it's a good thing, one way or the other, is therefore just a neutral statement of fact. Ironically, psychologist Frederick Wortham was a witness against segregation in the Brown v. Board case. Wortham would then go on to write Seduction of the Innocent, the book based on very shoddy psychology that accused the likes of DC Comics presenting Wonder Woman and Batman as being sexually immoral and Superman as a fascist, which led to Congress threatening to impose censorship measures on the comic industry, and the comic industry itself then imposing the comics code upon itself, imposing restrictive standards on the types of stories that could be told. And the irony is, the comics industry is ubiquitously dominated and founded by Jews. Jews in New York invented most American superheroes and have long dominated the comic industry. Think Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, the lads who invented Superman, or Bob Kane, not his real name, who invented Batman. The people who ran DC Comics were Jewish. The editor, Jeanette Kahn, who revolutionized DC in the 1960s, as well as Paul Levitz, were Jewish, as well as Marv Wolfman, who recreated the Teen Titans, wrote Batman for a long time. And then over at Marvel, of course, Stan Lee, real name Stanley Lieber, worked with Jack the King Kirby to create or bring new life to characters like Captain America, Thor, Iron Man, the Fantastic Four, and Spider-Man. And so we wouldn't have the comic industry without Jews in New York, and I'm a bit of a comic book fan myself, less so the recent progressive bastardization of those characters. So, ironically, Brown v. Board, led by progressive Jews, ended up destroying the comic industry, also led by Jews. So, I say this to say, yes, there are Jews on both sides of this issue, even if the comic industry itself, especially in Marvel Comics, was pushing for issues like civil rights. The X-Men were not a conscious civil rights analogue, but Stan Lee said of the X-Men and Black Panther, they were informed by concerns about anti-black discrimination or hatred of the other and the outsider. So that's just a tangent to say that there has been Jewish overrepresentation in a lot of industries throughout America, even if the politics aren't always ubiquitous. Regarding civil rights movement protests, they write that Jewish participation in the civil rights movement far transcended institutional associations. One black leader in Mississippi estimated that in the 1960s, the critical decade of the voter registration drives, as many as 90% of the civil rights lawyers in Mississippi were Jewish. Large numbers of them were recent graduates of Ivy League law schools. They worked around the clock, analyzing welfare standards, the bail system, arrest procedures, justice of the peace rulings, racing from one southern town to another. They obtained parade permits and issued complaints on jail beatings and intimidation. Jews similarly made up at least 30% of those who were counted as white volunteers who rode freedom buses to the south, registered black voters, and picketed segregated establishments. Among them were several dozen Reform rabbis who marched among the demonstrators in Selma and Birmingham. A number were arrested. Others were taken into custody for attempting to desegregate a swimming pool in St. Augustine, Florida. One of the demonstrating rabbis, Arthur Lelyveld, was severely beaten in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. A young physician, Edward Sachar, volunteering his medical services to the Freedom Marchers, Lilly lost his life as his automobile was forced off a Mississippi back road by local rednecks. All appalling, of course. We don't support political violence. Two young New Yorkers, Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, served in 1964 as voting registration volunteers in Meridian, Mississippi. One of their co-workers was a young black Mississippian, James Chaney. Together, they were waylaid and murdered by Klansmen, their bodies dumped in a secret grave. As much as any single factor, it was the nationwide attention given the discovery of their corpses that accelerated the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So, it was actually the murder of Jewish civil rights activists that became the national narrative that spurred on the rapid passage of civil rights legislation. The Reverend and Batya's posts were correct. Jews were inextricably involved in the civil rights movement. Returning to Brown v. Board of Education, we have a post here celebrating Jewish American Heritage Month by the US Department of Justice under the Biden administration, and it says, May is Jewish American Heritage Month, an apt occasion to celebrate the contributions of Jewish Americans to the struggle for civil rights in America. Jewish people for many years have faced both overt and more subtle anti-Semitism here in the United States and a long history of murderous persecution in Europe. Many American Jews have thus identified with the struggles of black Americans against Jim Crow and racial injustice and embraced the civil rights movement as part of a broader fight for justice and equality. So it appears that a perception of themselves as a persecuted minority in Europe, in Egypt, in America, and the migratory patterns that came with exodus and exile from Egypt, Israel, and Europe have caused Jews to identify with other self-identifying persecuted minority groups, and therefore involve themselves in progressive movements to fight for protections for those groups against potential persecutors in majority groups. This is the impetus behind human rights law in the aftermath of the Second World War. There is a book that explains this by Alan S. Rosenbaum, a Jewish lawyer, called Persecuting Nazi War Criminals, and it's the case for why international law is needed to ensure that ethnic European majority populations don't hide their war criminals, like the Nazis, at the Nuremberg trials, and shelter them from prosecution for persecuting minority groups. Basically, international law is based on two things: a belief in the blank slate, a universal standard human being for whom a global system of politics that you can rationally assent to can be formulated in law via international governance, and also the contradictory recognition that there are different ethnic groups, that they have different tensions, and so there is a fundamental mistrust of majority white populations because they may, at any point, arbitrarily start persecuting minority groups. So the state, international bodies, and laws must exist to permanently police majority populations to prevent them from persecuting minority groups. So the law does not serve to give justice to individuals, but rather protects minorities against majorities. And this may be why persecuted Jews, especially in the aftermath of the Holocaust, but with the long memory of expulsions from Europe and Egypt, become lawyers, and they specialize in progressive causes and civil rights. The DOJ quotes Martin Luther King, who told the American Jewish Congress in 1958, quote, "My people were brought to America in chains. Your people were driven here to escape the chains fashioned for them in Europe. Our unity is born of our common struggle for centuries, not only to rid ourselves of bondage, but to make oppression of any people by others an impossibility." Reflecting that common ground, some Jewish Americans played significant roles in the civil rights movement. For example, Jack Greenberg, whose parents fled anti-Semitic pogroms in Europe, succeeded Thurgood Marshall as Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, serving for 23 years. Greenberg argued Brown v. Board of Education as Marshall's co-counsel, as well as many other landmark Supreme Court cases challenging segregation, employment discrimination, and the death penalty. Jewish Americans also provided important support at key junctures in the civil rights movement. Fully half of the young people who flooded into Mississippi during the Freedom Summer of 1964 were Jewish. Among them were the aforementioned Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, murdered along with African-American activist James Chaney because of efforts to register black voters, which then led to the passage of the 1965 Voting Act. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Herschel served as an advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King and marched with him from Montgomery to Selma in 1964. That year, 17 rabbis were arrested with Dr. King in St. Augustine, Florida, after a challenge to racial segregation in public accommodations, the aforementioned swimming pool case. Major Jewish organizations have continued the fight. Groups such as the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, and the National Council of Jewish Women, interfaith groups like the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council, and many similar organizations have joined with other civil rights organizations to advocate for legislative changes, litigate in favor of reform, conduct community outreach and education, and steadfastly oppose the forces of hatred and bigotry. In these efforts, they stood side by side with the Department of Justice. So, the civil rights movement have continually had the backing of the federal government. This is why the Department of Justice had the now shut down Community Relations Service, which myself and Ayan Hirsi Ali have written about before, explaining that they actually liaise with community groups which have the backing of the Muslim Brotherhood, like the Council on American Islamic Relations. And it seems that progressive Jewish groups have allied with those Islamic groups, as have the Board of Deputies in the UK, complaining about Islamophobia in the same breath as anti-Semitism and encouraging more Muslim migration, even though the majority of anti-Semitism is coming from Muslims. Because if you're importing people from parts of the world where Mein Kampf is on sale at train stations, it's kind of natural that the average level of attacks and disparaging remarks made about Jews and pro-Palestine protests and pro-Gaza demonstrations in Britain and America are going to increase. But there's this cognitive dissonance by progressive Jews who see themselves as a persecuted ethnic and religious minority, and so extend the same identification out to other groups making similar claims of oppression, whether or not it's legitimate in terms of segregation with black Americans, or claims of religious oppression by Muslim interest groups with the backing of international terrorist organizations. Where did these activists come from? Well, they were trained across the United States in various schools and camps, such as the famous Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, established in 1932 by Miles Horton, a former student of Reinhold Niebuhr, the Lutheran seminarian, and it was established in Monteagle, Tennessee. The school was situated in the Tennessee Hills and initially focused on labor and adult education, but by the 1950s it shifted its attention to race relations and civil rights. Highlander was one of the few places in the South where integrated meetings could take place and served as a site of leadership training for Southern civil rights activists. Rosa Parks attended a 1955 workshop at Highlander 4 months before refusing to give up her seat that ignited the Montgomery bus boycott. So the famous Rosa Parks case was a deliberate act of protest and provocation. It wasn't just a spontaneous act of courage on Rosa Parks' part by refusing to being sent to the back of the bus and accepting segregation in Montgomery, Alabama. This was a conscious effort to create situations that could spark civil rights protests in order to advance the cause of desegregation and civil rights. Miles Horton, who claimed he had first met Martin Luther King during the civil rights leader's junior year at Morehouse College, invited King to participate in Highlander's anniversary celebration in 1957. While attending the celebration, an undercover agent sent by the Georgia Commission on Education took a photograph of King. The photo was sent throughout the South and used as a propaganda tool against King, with claims that it showed him attending a communist training school. This is according to the Stanford Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. So it's a source that speaks favourably of King and the school. But are the claims of communist infiltration legitimate? Well, the Tennessee newspapers wrote repeatedly about communist funding and communists who frequented the school, and the school was eventually shut down and relocated. It now operates today as a progressive youth training camp to fight capitalism. So its legacy should speak for itself. After King attended, Highlander continued to be a centre for developing future leaders of the movement such as Marion Barry, Diane Nash, and James Bevel. It was closed in 1961 when the Tennessee government revoked its charter on falsified charges that the school was being run for profit and that it did not fulfill its non-profit requirements. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference then took the citizenship program over that same year, feeling it offered, according to Martin Luther King, a plus for the SCLC and the movement in filling the need for developing new leadership as teachers and supervisors and providing the board educational base for the population at large through the establishment of citizenship schools conducted by these new leaders throughout the South. Under the leadership of the SCLC and the supervision of Clark, Dorothy Cotton, and Andrew Young, the schools eventually trained approximately 100,000 adults. In August 1961, Horton opened another school in Knoxville, Tennessee, called the Highlander Research and Education Center. He and the center participated in the 1968 Poor People's Campaign and, after King's assassination, erected a tent complex at Resurrection City in Washington, D.C., holding workshops until the police closed the encampment in June 1968. Now, Horton was not Jewish. There were lots of Jewish activists who came to the Highlander Folk School, but this was not a specifically Jewish activist camp. However, were the allegations that Martin Luther King was surrounded by communists and that Martin Luther King's inner circle contained progressive Jews accurate? Well, you might have heard of Stanley Levison. Levison was the treasurer of the American Jewish Congress in Manhattan and is most famous for being the legal defense of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the Jewish couple who leaked America's nuclear secrets to the USSR and were then executed as traitors. But Levison was very influential in the civil rights movement. This is just his Wikipedia page. It's about as neutral a presentation as you can get. He was apparently instrumental in all the activities of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, which took over the Highlander School, the organization that was established by Dr. Martin Luther King and other Southern black preachers to further the cause of civil rights. He had been initially introduced to King by Bayard Rustin, a Quaker in New York City in 1956, and the Quakers are just as guilty of advancing progressive causes. See Charlotte Gill's research into Quaker organizations in the UK and how they fund things like the Green Party. Leveson apparently took no pay despite being offered by King for his work. He said, quote, "The liberation struggle is the most positive and rewarding area of work anyone could experience." So, yet again, identifying as a persecuted minority, he sought to work on behalf of people who also identified as persecuted minorities and therefore involved himself in progressive politics. Leveson professionalised the fundraising of the organisation and took on many publicity tasks. In addition to serving as Dr. King's literary agent, he was a close advisor and ghostwriter for Dr. King. He co-wrote with Clarence Benjamin Jones one of the drafts for Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech presented at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom on August 28, 1963. So Leveson was a ghost co-writer of the I Have a Dream speech. You couldn't get a more influential speech in the civil rights movement than that, and a progressive Jewish man was heavily involved in doing that. So yet again, the claim by the Reverend and Batcher seems to be correct, that Jews were involved in a lot of progressive movements during the 20th century in America. Some of Leveson's conversations with King are reproduced verbatim from FBI wiretaps in Taylor Branch's biography of Martin Luther King, Parting the Waters, America in the King Years, 1954 to 63. Leveson himself initiated the end of his public association with Dr. King in 1963, following the revelation to Dr. King's circle that Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and then President John F. Kennedy had pressured Dr. King in person to break with Leveson. But, despite public pressure, Leveson continued to advise Martin Luther King until his assassination in April 1968. And afterwards, Leveson continued to work with Dr. King's wife, Coretta Scott King. The Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C., which, as we already mentioned, the original founder of the Highlander Folk School had also participated in holding workshops until the police had shut them down in D.C., well, that was based on a proposal by Leveson. In the 1950s, the FBI were monitoring Leveson because they considered him to be a major financial coordinator for the Communist Party USA. Before his death, in 1978, Leveson said, "I was not, nor am I now, a member of the Communist Party," and he consistently denied to the FBI that he was a communist. Well, was he a communist? This is The Forward, which is a Jewish non-profit, who wrote the article Martin Luther King's Dangerous Friendship. This is a Jewish non-profit who probably lean progressive, and yet they still consider the legacy of Leveson and his influence over MLK to be dangerous. Because they write, and I think this is quite confusing, despite some 70,000 documents filed, redacted and sealed, the government of the United States never produced a shred of evidence that Leveson was still a member of the Communist Party USA by the time he first met King in 1956. But Leveson was indeed a fundraiser and publicist for the Communist Party USA in the late 1940s, but he gradually severed his ties with the party as the harsh reality of the Soviet Union became more evident. Meanwhile, no connection has ever been established between MLK and the Communist Party USA, even though the implication of it by the FBI seriously complicated the relationship between King and the Kennedy brothers both before and after Kennedy's presidency. That doesn't mean that Leveson didn't still have communist sympathies. Members of the New Left did still have communist sympathies, even though the atrocities of Stalinism, including against Jews, of course, with the pogroms, were so evident that it put many of them off believing the USSR was the next socialist project. But the socialist and Marxist sympathies were then translated in the 1960s into New Left activism, into the adoption of principles by the Frankfurt School, into critical race theory in the 90s, and intersectionality under Kimberly Crenshaw. And again, it wasn't all just Jewish activists and academics who did this, but in the case of Stanley Leveson, his departure from the Communist Party, his being disaffected by the Soviet Union and perhaps internal Communist Party politics, isn't proof that progressivism and communism didn't infect the civil rights project, and it infected it from a specific oppressor-oppressed dynamic. The perception of Jewish people, black people, religious and ethnic minorities as oppressed classes so long as they live as diasporas in the lands of white majorities, their oppressors. So it seems that the Jewish experience and at least neo-Marxist oppressor-oppressed narratives map onto one another throughout the 20th century, throughout progressive causes. And this seems to be a pattern that Batya Ungersagon herself, a self-declared Jewish Marxist, has identified and now laments is no longer a part of the Democratic Party because Jews have been pushed out by other self-identifying oppressed minority groups who have a very low opinion of Jews. All of this is to say, yet again, it seems that Butch's assertion that Jews were instrumental to things like the civil rights movement is correct. The article ends with... This forward article ends with such an emphatic sentiment. It writes, "The Jewish embrace of the civil rights movement can no longer be just a historical wave to the many rabbis who marched with King. It certainly must include the martyrdom of Jewish idealists murdered in Mississippi and elsewhere. Its history remains an incomplete sentence without the name of one Stanley David Leveson." So even though they're saying that his friendship was a danger to King's public reputation, he remained an advisor behind the scenes, he may have retained communist sympathies, and he should be just as synonymous with American civil rights as Malcolm X and MLK. And I actually agree with this reading. I think that to rewrite history and say that Jewish people were not as instrumental to civil rights as black people were in the American 20th century would be dishonest. But when people other than progressive Jews or Jewish non-profits point this out, they're called anti-Semites, conspiracy theorists, and white nationalists, and I just don't think that's the case. What about the other progressive movements of the 20th century? Well, I can't think of a more epoch-defining one than feminism, and Wikipedia here has a very long list of Jewish feminists. Now, this is not practicing Jews, it's not Orthodox, it's not Reform, many of them are secular. This is just based on ethnicity, and there is a disproportionate overrepresentation of Jews among the feminist movement. Most famously, I would say, is Betty Friedan, whose real name is Betty Naomi Goldstein. Friedan was elected the first president of the National Organization for Women in 1966, which aimed to bring women into the mainstream of American society now in fully equal partnership with men. And her book, The Feminine Mystique, is famous for depicting housewifery in the 1950s and 60s as domestic drudgery, something that women should escape to achieve individual autonomy and economic independence from men. And she's very famous for her exchange with French feminist Simone de Beauvoir, author of The Second Sex, the single worst book that I've ever read, who herself was not Jewish. She was born to a Catholic family and seems to be, throughout her life, in continual revolt against her parents' Christian faith. She wanted to defy biology in contradictory terms. If you want further insights into The Second Sex, I'll link down in the description my original video on Lotus Eaters with Carl Benjamin going through all of it, and if you would like a video explaining The Second Sex, I can do one for this channel. Beauvoir wasn't Jewish. She was, though, the longtime lover of Jean-Paul Sartre, who obviously wrote about anti-Semitism. He wrote the foreword to Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, identifying colonized peoples as an oppressed minority worldwide, even though they're the demographic majority, which is why we're now hearing the term global majority heritage to make white people feel marginalized. And he praised violent overthrow of colonial regimes and said that if you kill a European oppressor, you've killed two men. You've killed the oppressed identity that the oppressed person has internalized and the oppressor. So you're getting a 2-for-1 on your liberation activity. Sartre's work on existentialism heavily influenced Simone de Beauvoir's work on gender, because as Abigail Favale writes in Genesis of Gender, she takes a gender existentialist approach rather than a gender essentialist approach. She completely disembodies the idea of gender from biological reality. She says, in her famous quote, "One is not born, but one becomes a woman," which means that womanhood is an assumed identity, and therefore it can be decoupled from biology, and Simone de Beauvoir actually considered biology to be a form of oppression for women, so you should do all you can to escape your biological constraints, your physical constraints, your ideological constraints, and live as one global egalitarian brotherhood, the final line of her book, with men, because she was a communist. All of this is to say that Friedan and de Beauvoir disagreed heavily when they had a debate in America in the 60s, and this is relayed in a passage of Michael Knowles' book, Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. Michael Knowles, himself working for Ben Shapiro at the Daily Wire, so again, not an anti-Semite. Michael Knowles relays the argument between Friedan, which is republished in Friedan's collection, It Changed My Life, where Beauvoir declared, "No woman should be authorized to stay at home to raise her children. Society should be totally different. Women should not have that choice, precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make that one." Then, to make sure Friedan had understood the enormity of her point, she added, "It is a way of forcing women in a certain direction." Friedan objected to Beauvoir's rigidity. "I follow the argument," she responded, "but politically at the moment I don't agree with it. There is such a tradition of individual freedom in America that I would never say that every woman must put her child in a child care center." One cannot quite tell from Friedan's comments whether she rejected Beauvoir's argument as wrong in itself, or merely on the practical grounds that it would fall on deaf ears, given America's more conservative views of sex and liberty. Friedan may have felt that America was not ready for such radicalism. Perhaps she was just not ready for it herself. So, yes, Betty Friedan, Jewish, radical individualist, but even she was too moderate for Simone de Beauvoir. However, there were lots of radical Jewish feminists involved in the 20th century feminist movement. Think of Gloria Steinem, famous for the phrase, "A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle." Gloria Steinem was born in Ohio to a father of Jewish descent from Germany and Poland. Andrea Dworkin was a radical feminist, best known for her writings against pornography, which I actually agree with, but the rest of her sexual politics seethes with misandric resentment. She was born in New Jersey to Harry Dworkin and Sylvia Spiegel. Her father was the grandson of a Russian Jew who fled Russia to escape military service, and her mother was the child of Jewish immigrants from Hungary. Then there's Shemalev Firestone, the feminist famous for having died alone, childless, with no loved ones, surrounded by cats, and nobody found her body for a month until her neighbors started to smell her corpse decomposing from her apartment, and she died possibly of malnutrition and neglect. Shemalev Firestone was born in Canada, the second of 6 children, and the first daughter of Kate Weiss, a German Jewish refugee who fled the Holocaust, and Sol Feuerstein, a salesman from Brooklyn. Firestone's parents were Orthodox Jews, and in April 1945, when Firestone was 4 months old, her father participated in the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. Very heroic of her father to do that. Unfortunately for Sol, his daughter had a profoundly negative impact on the lives of women in the West in the 20th and 21st centuries with her book, The Dialectic of Sex. She too was in open revolt against nature, writing in The Dialectic of Sex, "Feminists have to question not just all of Western culture, but the organization of culture itself, and further, even the organization of nature." She was in revolt against reality, and no wonder she was miserable. Then there's Germaine Greer, the Australian feminist, who is famous for writing The Female Eunuch and has actually dissented from modern feminists because she is a biological essentialist. She realizes that sex exists and is slightly sane on that issue. Germaine Greer believes she is Jewish because of the opaque way in which her ancestry has been relayed to her by her parents. For example, her father, Reg Greer, said he was born in South Africa, but he was actually born Robert Hamilton King in Tasmania. She learned he was christened Robert Henry Eric Ernest Hambert, and her mother, Margaret Peggy May LaFranc, had married Reg in March 1937, and Reg had converted to Catholicism right before the wedding. Peggy was a milliner, and Reg was a newspaper advertising salesman, but despite her Catholic upbringing and her father's open anti-Semitism, Greer became convinced her father was secretly of Jewish heritage. She believed her grandmother had been a Jewish woman named Rachel Weiss, but admits she'd probably made this up out of an intense longing to be Jewish. Despite not knowing whether she had any Jewish ancestry, Greer felt Jewish and began to involve herself in the Jewish community. She learned Yiddish, joined a Jewish group, and dated Jewish men. So, whether or not she is actually ethnically Jewish, she certainly feels drawn to Jews. She feels a kind of kinship with Jewish identity, and that seems to have informed her feminism in some way. Then there's Erica Jong, the American author who in 1973 wrote Fear of Flying, the book which best sums up the mentality of hookup culture and the sexual revolution in the 70s. She coined the term, and I apologize for any children listening, the zipless fuck. It meant the platonic ideal of sex where nobody struggles with buttons or zippers, and there are no emotional strings attached, there are no complications, it's just sex, pure and without emotions and attachments. And this idea was presented as a platonic ideal, open to both men and women in the age of the sexual revolution. The idea is that sex should be decoupled from consequences and commitment. If you want to learn more about this and feminism in the 20th century, I recommend picking up my friend Mary Harrington's book, Feminism Against Progress, where she goes over Greer, Firestone, Zhang, and the like. Zhang was born in Manhattan in 1942, one of 3 daughters of Seymour Mann and Ida Mirsky. Her father was a businessman of Polish-Jewish ancestry. Her mother was born in England of a Russian Jewish family, and they both moved to America. Then you have infamous hack Judith Butler, who frequently just plagiarized Michel Foucault, himself also Jewish. Judith Butler was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1956 to a family of Hungarian Jewish and Russian Jewish descent. Most of her maternal grandmother's family was murdered in the Shoah. Her parents were practicing Reform Jews. Her mother was raised Orthodox and become conservative and then Reform, while her father was raised as Reform, and as a child and teenager, Butler attended both Hebrew school and special classes on Jewish ethics. So it seems that in her interviews, she may have been rebelling against her parents' conservative or even Reform religious tradition and becoming a radical gender abolitionist. So even if she was in revolt against Judaism, Judaism informed her feminism as it did the likes of Shmuley Firestone. And then finally there's Gertrude Stein, the famous poet and playwright who was born to a middle-class Jewish family in Pennsylvania. Now, all of these women don't have ubiquitous views on feminism, on sex, on gender. You couldn't put Butler and Greer in the same room and get a lot of agreement on whether or not women exist as a distinct biological category, for example. But they all seem to have either a Jewish ancestry or Jewish identity that they identify with or were rebelling against. So, yet again, examining Batch's claim, Judaism did play a significant role in 20th century progressive movements like feminism. Now, it's important to stress, of course, that not all the feminists of the 20th or 19th or 18th centuries were. Mary Wollstonecraft, considered the first feminist who wrote against the demon of property in her rejoinder to Edmund Burke in his Reflections on the Revolution in France, was not Jewish. Neither was Harriet Taylor Mill, wife of John Stuart Mill, who pushed for the total emancipation of women from their economic bondage in their marriage to men. She wasn't Jewish. Susan B. Anthony and lots of the British suffragettes weren't Jewish. Though, according to Jewish Journal, there were lots of Jewish suffragists, both in Britain and in America, who helped push for women's right to vote, despite this being against what the majority of women at the time actually wanted. Women's suffrage was a unpopular minority position. While Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth are some of the more celebrated suffragists, there's a long list of important but lesser-known activists, including Jewish women. Among them were Gloria Steinem's grandmother, Pauline Perlmutter Steinem, Toledo's first female elected official, Rose Schneiderman, New York City factory worker turned trade union leader, and Montana Belle Fliegelman Winstein, aide to the first Congresswoman, Jeanette Rankin. Social justice is one of the foundations of our tradition. Sally Priesand, the first female ordained rabbi in America, told the Journal, "Anyone raised with Jewish values knows the importance of tikkun olam. I'd like to think that Jewish suffragists were inspired by their religious background. I'm sure there are Jews that dispute there even being a female rabbi, by the way, but this is certainly the opinion of some Jews." The Jewish Journal writes, although suffragists filled their ranks, not all Jewish women's groups, such as the National Council of Jewish Women, formally supported the 19th Amendment. Suffragist leaders were invited to speak at NCJW conventions, however, and several chapters held pro-suffrage programs and donated money to suffrage groups. Hadassah, founded in 1912, took 6 years to get on board and sent a pro-ratification telegram to President Woodrow Wilson. Neither were all of the feminists in the 20th century pushing the sexual revolution and women's liberation in America Jewish either. There was Kate Millett, who seems to have been demonically possessed, Carol Hanisch, famous for generating the phrase "the personal is the political," or Catherine McKinnon, who again, radical feminist, insane liberal, but I agree with her stance on banning pornography. She once analogized people being aware of pornography existing as having your ear pressed to an apartment wall while you hear a man beating up a woman and then refusing to call the police. It's a good analogy. The Cosmopolitan editor as well, Helen Gurley Brown, who wrote Sex and the Single Girl, which lied to women and said that you could have hookups for 20 years and then still find your Mr. Right, get married and have kids in your 40s, you can have a career, you can have it all, the promise of Sex and the City. She was not Jewish. Here's an article from Evie Magazine from 2020, taking extracts from Sue Ellen Browder, who was a writer at Cosmopolitan, who herself was not Jewish, from her book, which explained that the likes of Cosmopolitan were just inventing stories of empowered women having hookups and abortions and careers to sell other women the dream of the sexual revolution, when not only were these stories fictitious, but the writers themselves, the owner of the magazine, like Helen Gurley Brown, were in committed monogamous marriages, and they had kids of their own. The article explains that Browder was fired from a newspaper for getting pregnant, and so she turned to feminism, and embraced the message of Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem about the discrimination women faced in the workplace. Her experience drove her to believe that women were kept oppressed and away from the workforce, especially after reading Friedan's book The Feminine Mystique. After giving birth, Browder got a job writing for Cosmopolitan, and carefully omitted the fact that she had a baby during the interview process. At Cosmopolitan, her job was to spread the message of Helen Gurley Brown, the magazine's editor-in-chief. Brown's message to single women was, hard work and sex will set you free, as long as you don't have children. Browder's job was to sell the idea that for a woman to be fulfilled in life, she has to 1. Work hard, 2. Take the pill or use some other contraceptive, and 3. If the contraceptive failed, get an abortion. To put it simply, the magazine was selling the idea that the sexual revolution was both for unmarried sex and against motherhood. Helen Gurley Brown pushed the propaganda that women are no different from men, and therefore should pursue sex without attachment just like men. Basically, Erica Jong's Zipless from Fear of Flying. It encouraged the rejection of the outdated code of morality. It urged women to seek a glamorous lifestyle filled with the thrill and excitement of sex without consequences. And of course, magazines like Evie and the likes of Louise Perry and Mary Harrington are now revisiting that settlement 60 years on from the sexual revolution and realizing it has left many women miserable and distant from the goals of family and a loving relationship, and causing them to have a career in conflict with those understandable life goals, which they should want because they are more fulfilling than filling out a spreadsheet for the rest of their lives. Browder notes that in her tell-all memoir, the elites didn't necessarily practice what they preached. Helen Gurley Brown, even when the message in her magazine encouraged women to remain single, was herself happily married. Browder wrote, Helen Gurley Brown didn't listen to the nonsense we were peddling at Cosmo any more than I did. She was married and by all accounts faithful to the same man for 50 years. She called David her pussycat. So what we're seeing here is not all the feminists spewing this poison to impressionable young women were Jewish. They were informed by some Jewish writers, but there was a balance in who was writing this tripe and ruining the lives of women for a generation. However, the original claim was Jews were at the forefront of progressive movements in the 20th century by Batya, and that appears to be true for feminism even if all the feminists were not Jewish. The other evil innovation of the sexual revolution was, of course, pornography and more permissive publishing standards around obscenity. And here is an article by Jewish writer H.A. Hazony in First Things about why pornography is evil because it is being weaponized to turn a generation of young men into physical and spiritual eunuchs. And if anyone is concerned about the Nick Fuentes-Tucker Carlson interview, if you watch it, what Hazony says in this article sounds identical to the concerns expressed by Fuentes about the impact of pornography not just on young men, but his own viewers who have written to him in super chats expressing their struggles spiritually, but also physically, with pornography. And if a Jewish writer is recognizing the same phenomena, then it's not an anti-Semitic problem. So he writes, among older educators, the view that pornography is merely not so nice a habit of young men is unfortunately still prevalent. According to this perspective, the sexual vice of pornography is problematic, mostly because it objectifies women, or because it creates unhealthy expectations for marital life. Both of these are true, by the way. These things are true, but these adults fail to see that their students' pornography habit is not a sexual vice, but a disease. A more substantial iteration of this position argues porn reflects an egocentric philosophy that places one's own pleasure ahead of other people's interests. On this view, the problem with the porn user is that he views women as objects from which he can derive a one-sided pleasure. Again, also accurate. Along these lines, conservatives often view autoeroticism as the problem with porn, but this misses the heart of the matter. The real problem with pornography consumption is not that it is a sexual vice, but it is an addiction. Porn consumers are not choosing their own interests over those of others. Rather, they are actively harming themselves and therefore decidedly choosing against their own interests. This misunderstanding stems from the fact that pornography itself has undergone radical transformations in recent decades. It's no longer a hustler or a playboy stashed in a bush or beneath one's bed, that you are horrified if your parents find out about it. It is being streamed on demand in the millions of new videos that get uploaded every week to the smartphones of children. As Hazony points out here, the children of the 21st century have been subjected to what the great anti-porn crusader Gary Wilson called the Great Porn Experiment. With the advent of the internet, a new technology that stimulated the brain in a novel way entered the bedrooms of every child in the nation. To understand the ubiquity of the phenomenon, consider Wilson's claim that he couldn't organize control groups for his experiments because he couldn't find young men who hadn't already been extensively exposed to internet porn. The American Psychological Association believes the average age of first exposure to pornography is 13, with some children being exposed as young as 5. Lacey Bentley, on the other hand, found the average age of first exposure is just under 10. An entire generation has been drenched with experimental stimulation for years without consideration of possible side effects. And one such side effect, as Freya India has written about excellently on Substack, is that if both men and increasingly women have been watching this from an early age, think about Billie Eilish saying that porn ruined her life and then prompted the Louisiana legislature to impose age verification restrictions in their state, and this nationwide cascade now of age verification bans that the likes of Pornhub have refused to comply with. If increasing numbers of men and women have both viewed this, how do you repair from the amount of damage and abuse and traumatized people faking ecstasy on screen in order to have a genuine and authentic and unguarded relationship with someone? I think all this emotional damage, not just sexual dysfunction, not just misallocated or misaligned expectations, I think a lot of this emotional trauma inflicted deliberately for profit, for social engineering on an entire generation of children is one of the reasons why fewer Zoomers than their predecessors are not just hooking up, but having relationships, getting married, and having children. And I say all of this as being recently married, as being lucky enough to have met a wonderful woman who believes in Catholicism and all of these revitalized conservative values and hopes to have kids next year. But like a lot of people probably watching, we would rather have dated fewer people or maybe had fewer hookups, admittedly, in my case, and would have rather have met each other early and had many more years together and possibly even had more children, if circumstances allowed. So imagine just how many people who aren't as fortunate as me to have met my wife, who are in that position and are now facing a life alone, and it's just so that porn companies could have made profit with an experimental technology that liberals and libertarians were standing by because they wanted to protect an adult's autonomous, anonymous right to goon themselves to ecstasy. I think the porn industry is inarguably the most immoral institution that exists in our world at the moment. It needs to be completely banned and all of its purveyors and many of its performers thrown in prison. Many of the performers just need to be stuck in a rehab clinic for their own good because lots of them are just reenacting their own childhood traumas on screen. And so remember, every time that you might succumb to temptation and indulge in pornography, you're watching someone who is probably on drugs, traumatized, suicidal, and you cannot even verify the consent of the participants watching as an observer. So I advise you to abstain, not just for your own good, but for the good of everyone participating in this exploitative industry. So, it's a very difficult topic to address, the overrepresentation of Jewish people in porn. Now, there are dissenting views on this, and again, I consulted my Jewish learning for the Jewish opinion on pornography, and there is disagreement. It says here that Judaism places a premium on modesty, against which, obviously, masturbation and pornography is a transgression, but then there are also strange passages in the Talmud which preach a lack of sexual restraint and where rabbis are measuring each other's members, which is not the greatest example of modesty. So there seems to be an internal conflict within Judaism. I've heard, for example, Jews complain that Dennis Prager, when he was defending watching pornography on Matt Fradd's Pints with Aquinas some years ago, that he wasn't representing the authentic Jewish opinion, but at least that means there are two competing Jewish traditions, and so one tradition can justify pornography where the other one condemns it. So this needs to be a conversation that I think Jews need to resolve among themselves. I'm not qualified to have that debate. I'm just reading Jewish sources. But it is conspicuous when a rabbi's in charge of Pornhub. I can't think of anything that is going to generate anti-Semitism among young men more than the person in charge of the instrument that is preying upon them for profit and ideology, as the leaks by Sound Investigation showed of Pornhub executives saying that we're feeding subversive LGBT and trans content via the algorithm to young people in order to get them hooked on more niche and therefore lucrative and profitable content. I can't think of anything that's going to increase anti-Semitism more than the head of that predatory industry being a out and proud Jewish rabbi who used to do legal advocacy work on behalf of child predators. I wish I was exaggerating, but as the forward, again, writes, It's really not as shocking as it sounds that a rabbi, Solomon Friedman, has become one of the top officials running Pornhub, the free internet behemoth. After all, the investment group that bought Pornhub is called Ethical Capital Partners. They've now rebranded to ALO to try and avoid all the bad press brought their way by the likes of Layla Micklethwait, the New York Times, and payment processors that said, hey, you're hosting millions of child abuse images on this website, and you've been asked by survivors to take down the footage of their abuse, and you've ignored them. And so they removed millions of videos that they couldn't verify the age of, and started doing this press tour of engaging in donating proceeds to philanthropic endeavors like climate change and women's rights, while continuing to sell pornography that they couldn't verify the consent of participants in. Not good. Solomon Friedman, the rabbi in question, an investment company's co-founder and chief compliance officer, is trying to clean up internet porn. Bear in mind, the Sound Investigations leaks came out after Friedman took over the company. Forward, again, a Jewish nonprofit, explain people's confusion about whether or not promiscuity in pornography violates the tenets of Judaism. They write that Judaism is pretty sex positive. Most Jewish texts about sex focus on understanding and regulating the act, not warning people of its dangers. The Talmud has passages instructing husbands to have regular sex with their wives, emphasizing the importance of pleasure and encouraging experimentation. There's even a tale of a student hiding under his rabbi's bed when his teacher has sex with his wife. When the student is caught, he argues that everything is Torah and he was just taught to learn. Of course, there will be Jews who dispute this interpretation, but there seems to be a scriptural justification for involving oneself in the smut industry, and of course, Jews who are not Reform or Orthodox rabbis will identify with progressive movements to liberate marginalized people, and therefore they will see any act of liberation as an act of social justice, and so breaking taboos about obscenity and sexuality is a movement towards said liberation. Therefore, progressive Jews will be involved in pornography whether or not they are religious or secular. They do say that Friedman was never a practicing rabbi. He grew up in an Orthodox family in Canada and was ordained in Judaism, but then became a criminal defense lawyer, making a name for himself defending extremely sketchy characters accused of offenses such as sexual abuse, possession of child exploitation material, and drunk driving. So Friedman's rabbinical plaudits are just fuel for a clicky headline like the one published by Time, according to Forward. The problem with Pornhub isn't necessarily the fact that it provides porn, according to Forward, which, yeah, that is the problem, though of course plenty of people object to that too, and they say it's existed for thousands of years in ancient Greek pottery and temples in India. Okay, if you can't tell the difference between cartoons of sexual acts and more videotaped sex acts than our ancestors collectively witnessed or participated in across thousands of lifetimes, then you're a bad faith actor, I'm afraid. It says the more pressing issue for Pornhub is how it regulates its content. Until recently, anyone could upload a video, which has led to a lot of non-consensual and child exploitation on the platform. Poor moderation meant there was little recourse to get videos removed, or at least to get them removed before someone had downloaded them and re-uploaded them somewhere else. So all of these problems, it says, while Friedman could theoretically apply the Talmudic arguments he argued as a young man in Jerusalem to the complex ethical questions posed by pornography, most of his work seems to concern complex technological challenges, such as how to digitally fingerprint videos or implement facial scans to ensure all the performers are consenting and of age. So all of those problems are legitimate. The question arises as to whether or not Friedman is a credible man to address this, considering his legal career involved him defending people accused of possession of child sexual exploitation material, including one man charged with possessing and attempting to import said material into Canada, who faced a minimum sentence of a year in prison. He was represented at trial by Solomon Friedman. Following a week-long trial, he was acquitted of all charges. He also represented multiple defendants involved in sexual assault allegations. The veracity of those allegations may be questionable. The fact that they got off without jail time means perhaps the evidence was not all there. But if Solomon Friedman is defending people who were alleged to have possessed child sexual exploitation in his legal career, is he really the man to clean that up on the platform? And Forward don't address this question. They say, while Friedman could theoretically apply the Talmudic arguments he learned as a young man in Jerusalem to the complex ethical questions posed by Pornhub, most of his work seems to concern complex technological challenges, such as how to digitally fingerprint videos or implement facial scans to ensure all the performers are consenting and of age. So they say that he's only going to talk about the technology and logistics rather than provide moral arguments from a Jewish position for Pornhub. And then they skip past the fact that his legal career may cause a conflict of interest with the duties to police illegal and abusive content on the platform, and instead go straight to, quote, realistically, Friedman's Judaism is probably most relevant to white nationalist conspiracy theorists who endorse the lie that porn is a tool a cabal of wealthy Jews use to control the world and decimate the white population by tempting them to masturbate instead of procreate. Well, that's also the concern of the likes of Hazony in this article. He's saying that it's decimated a generation of young men, it's robbed them of their ability to emotionally connect with women, it's having them engage in a surrogate activity of sexual pleasure, which fries their dopamine receptors and gets them addicted. It's far more addictive than heroin or online gambling, which are also issues, to the benefit of porn companies that push progressive narratives, and then the progressive narratives get them hooked on more niche and perverted types of porn, which are more profitable for the companies. If this is a concern of a practicing Jew, then no, it turns out it's not just a white supremacist conspiracy theory. It's a concern of people who don't want the next generation of young boys to be preyed on by a corporation that doesn't give a damn whether or not they get married and have children, and has no morals and wants to make them lifelong addicts to its product. It's a concern for anyone who wants a civilization. Thank you very much. So stop poisoning the well by pretending that Solomon Friedman's Jewish identity and his religion are not relevant to the fact that he's in a position of seniority over one of the largest and most profitable porn institutions in the world that has been credibly accused of laundering child abuse material while he, in his legal career, defended child abusers. And I'm sorry, you can't have a rabbi at the head of a pornography company and then say, don't talk about whether or not his Jewish identity might be relevant. You also can't have the lead investor in OnlyFans, Leonid Radvinsky, born in Ukraine, who then emigrated to Chicago, who is Jewish, as the lead investor in OnlyFans, who is responsible for the shift from OnlyFans to being a kind of gig economy platform to a parasocial pornography purveying platform that is now one of the titans of the industry and again is preying upon young men, hijacking their desire to provide for women to establish parasocial relationships with them, and selling to young women the dream of being an influencer if just they take their clothes off, ruining their dating prospects too. Radvinsky founded the pornographic webcam site My Free Cams, and then became the majority owner of OnlyFans. Now, the OnlyFans CEO is Indian, and the company is headquartered in the UK, but, like it or not, the majority owner is also Jewish. So there is an overrepresentation of Jews in pornography. There has been throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Yes, Hustler and Playboy were not owned or run by Jewish men, so again, not all, but there is an overrepresentation here, and it needs to be addressed. And it should be addressed by the Jewish community, because if you want young men to not be anti-Semitic, you should probably stop Jews owning the companies that prey on them. Now, why could this be? We've already explained the membership of Jews in progressive movements, feminism and civil rights. We've already explored the potential debate between Jews of Reform and Orthodox traditions over the contents of the Talmud, the Tanakh, that may or may not justify sexual promiscuity. Again, I'll leave that to Jewish scholars to litigate. But there is this famous quote by Al Goldstein, who is a famous smut purveyor, who was charged 19 times with obscenity, who was friends with the head of Hustler magazine. When he was interviewed for a book in 2004 by author Luke Ford, Ford asked Goldstein why Jews were dramatically overrepresented in the porn industry. So this is something that Goldstein and Ford both recognize. Again, it's not an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I'm not attributing motive here. Goldstein answered, "The only reason that Jews are in pornography is that we think Christ sucks. Catholicism sucks. We don't believe in authoritarianism. Pornography thus becomes a way of defiling Christian culture, and as it penetrates the very heart of the American mainstream and is no doubt consumed by those very same wasps, its subversive character becomes more charged." When Ford asked what does it mean to be a Jew? Goldstein responded, it doesn't mean anything. It means that I'm called a Jewish slur. Ford asked, do you believe in God? Goldstein says, I believe in me. I'm God. Screw God. God is your need to believe in some super being. I am the super being. I am your God. Admit it. We're random. We're the flea on the butt of a dog. This quote is often shared around by people that point out that there is an overrepresentation of Jews in porn, which is why I've read it out, but it might also provide some insight. Now, this might be the rantings and ravings of just one very resentful and unhinged madman. It is undeniable that quotes such as this and actions such as his are indistinguishable from demonic possession. If you want to read it as a metaphor, go ahead. It may well not be. But even if he does not identify as being Jewish beyond it being an identity that invites oppression by whites and Christians, it may be relevant because he brings up Catholicism specifically. And if you want an example of how the long memory of expulsions has a powerful hold over the collective consciousness of Jewish people, there's a great scene in Sopranos, I think it's in season 3. There's a character called Ariel, and he's talking to Tony, and he relays how the Romans kicked the Jews out of Jerusalem, and then he goes, and where are the Romans now? Basically, the idea is that the Catholic Church is the continuation of the Roman Empire because Emperor Constantine established Christianity as the ruling religion of the Roman Empire and actually went back to Jerusalem and rediscovered the holy sites that Romans had concreted over and ironically marked with pagan symbols. And so Christianity is the continuity of the Roman Empire, and even though the Romans crucified Jesus, there is blame to be laid at the feet of Christianity for the Jewish expulsions from Jerusalem. And that's also combined with the Catholic Church's expulsion of Jews from Europe during the Middle Ages, which is where the term blood libel comes from, the accusation that Jewish people were drinking Christian children's blood. This is the phrase that's still used now when people say that Israel's committing genocide in Palestine and Gaza. They say that is a blood libel against Jewish people. It's a reference to the Europeans' treatment of Jews in the 13th century. And so there is a long historical memory here that even people who aren't religious Jews, who hate God, who don't think of themselves as having a positive Jewish identity, just one that invites persecution, that people like Goldstein hang on to. And the reason I raise this is because Benjamin Netanyahu recently said he was reading a book about the Jews fighting the Romans throughout antiquity. So this is still a prescient concern for some Jews, not all, that they offer up that doesn't really enter the minds of most Catholics, because we don't think of ourselves as Romans who are out to oppress the Jews. So this might be a one-sided thing that might cause the most unhinged Jews to use progressive movements as a way to revenge themselves against white Europeans and Catholics. Again, want to stress, not all Jews. I want to be very fair here. But it seems that the likes of Al Goldstein certainly thought that way. What about immigration? I would argue it's the most important issue of our time, both in the US and the UK. Were Jews overrepresented in movements for mass migration and multiculturalism? Well, looking at Eric Kaufman's 2019 book, White Shift, Eric himself, ethnically Jewish, on page 48, he explains the origins of liberal progressivism in left modernism in New York. He writes, liberal progressives were the first, recognizably modern, left liberal open borders movement. They combined aspects of individualist anarchism, ecumenism, and progressivism into a new synthesis. Two intellectual traditions nourished liberal progressivism: Anglo-American anarchism and secularized Reform Judaism. The former was represented in the persona of William James, the second by Felix Adler. James was an established New England writer who developed the philosophical stance known as pluralism. Pluralism initially had little to say about ethnic diversity, but rather called for people to combine aspects of multiple ethical systems in order to arrive at the truth. Adler was a German Jewish writer and academic who took Reform Judaism's metaphorical storyline to its cosmopolitan conclusion, where Reform Jewish theology called for Jews to work to unite the world's peoples under monotheism. Adler went further, suggesting Jews should dissolve themselves once the task was finished. The perpetuity of the Jewish race depends upon the perpetuity of the Jewish religion. So long as there shall be a reason of existence for Judaism, so long the individual Jews will keep apart and will do well to do so. When this process of evangelization is accomplished, the individual members of the Jewish race will look about them and perceive that there is as great and perhaps greater liberty in religion beyond the pale of their race and will lose their peculiar idiosyncrasies, and their distinctiveness will fade, and eventually the Jewish race will die. So he was obsessed with dissolving Jewish identity in an egalitarian blank slate so that Jews wouldn't stand out and therefore be persecuted. Adler's ideas naturally went down like a lead balloon among Jews, Eric Kaufmann writes, but James and other anarcho-pluralists applauded. By 1878, Adler had become president of the Free Religious Association, an Anglo-American free-thinking outfit, and led the New York Ethical Culture Society from its inception in 1877. Adler and James influenced each other and were formative influences on John Dewey, who would later gain fame as America's public philosopher. Originally a Congregationalist minister, Dewey called for his New England denomination to universalize itself out of existence, much like Adler did for Jews. Between 1905 and 1910, Dewey developed the notion that all groups should give and receive cultural influence in cosmopolitan interchange. He was also the first to openly reject the Anglo-Protestant tradition of American nationhood. The dangerous thing, said Dewey, is for one fact to isolate itself, to try to live off its past, and then impose itself upon other elements, or, at least, to keep itself intact and thus refuse to accept what other cultures have to offer, so as thereby to be transmuted into authentic Americanism. He further argued that neither Englandism, nor New Englandism, nor Puritan, nor Cavalier, neither any more than Teuton or Slav, can do anything but furnish one note in a vast symphony. So, it was liberal Protestantism combined with liberal Judaism that invented the multicultural narrative that laid the groundwork for the argument that America is just a nation of immigrants rather than of Anglo-Protestant settlers, as Samuel Huntington would have written later on in the 21st century. It was those two traditions that formed the ideological backbone of multiculturalism, which became the post hoc rationalization for mass migration. And this is all according to Eric Kaufmann in White Shift. This ideological justification then led up to the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, the act which revolutionized American immigration law and, rather than sourcing the majority of its immigration from European stock, opened it up to the rest of the world. And after 1965, European immigrants to America became only 20% of annual migration, and they received a lot more immigrants from Asia. Today, Asia provides 28% of all immigrants, the most of any continent. We know that 71% of H-1B applications come from India, and within 10 years, the Asian population of America doubled. So by 1975, the Asian population of America was twice that it had been before Hart-Celler, and it was decreased because of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the treatment of Japanese people during the Second World War. The co-sponsor of the bill, which is why it's known as Hart-Celler rather than the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, was Emanuel Celler, who was a New York congressman, the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, and the 39th Dean of the United States House of Representatives, who was descended from Jewish and Catholic immigrants. And yes, not just Protestants, there was an overrepresentation, especially in the 50s and 60s, of Catholic advocacy groups of Irish and Italian descent in pro-immigration causes, and they made co-belligerents out of Jewish immigrants and their descendants. So, admittedly, especially with the current and previous popes' progressive attitudes towards migration, both South American migration into America and Muslim migration into Europe, we Catholics have to get our house in order too. But that also doesn't mean we should deny that, as Batya has asserted, yes, Jews were overrepresented in many left-wing movements, including mass migration. And this is despite Israel not practicing mass migration, definitely not taking in millions of migrants from the Third World, and certainly not being multicultural, or denying that there is such a thing as an Israeli, like we are told to deny that there is such a thing as an American, or that English identity is founded in ethnic ancestry. Because even though Israel was established as a secular state in 1948 by David Ben-Gurion, it was established constitutionally as a nation for the ethnic Jewish people. And so there was no confusion as to what constitutes a Jew, whereas many Jewish diasporas abroad have pushed for the liquidation of all identities, even including Judaism, into a indistinct civic nationalist liberal multicultural citizenship. And the reason I raise this is because that irritating double standard, which renders the heritage and majority populations of Europe and America incapable of distinguishing between themselves and immigrants who commit more crimes, who don't need to be in the country, taking job opportunities and homes from the indigenous families, that inability is perceived as a double standard between their countries and what Israel enjoys. And so you can't make Israel the centerpiece of the international conversation. You can't have Jewish groups advocate for the protection of Jews and Jewish identity while telling those heritage majority populations you can't play identity politics and you can't enjoy the same standard of nationalism or national identity that Jews and Israel enjoy. Again, my Jewish learning explains to us the career of Emanuel Seller. He campaigned for Congress as a Tammany Hall Democrat in 1922 in a district that had never elected a Democrat before, and he won by 3,000 votes. And in March of 1923, he assumed a seat he would hold for 49 years and 10 months, the second longest term in congressional history. His maiden speech on the House floor was during the consideration of the Johnson Immigration Act of 1924. 3 years earlier, Congress had imposed a quota that limited immigration for persons of any nationality to 3% of that nationality's presence in the United States in 1910, with an overall annual admission limit of 356,000 immigrants. This national origin system was structured to discriminate against Eastern and Southern European immigrants such as Italians, Russians, Poles, Slavs, and of course Yiddish-speaking Jews. The Johnson Act of 1924, which Seller opposed, sought further restriction by cutting the total annual number of immigrants and limiting each nationality to 2% of its total number in 1890, virtually eliminating immigrants who were not from England, France, Ireland, or Germany, and Seller opposed such restrictions all throughout his career. The Johnson Act passed and was signed into law. Despite this, Seller had found his cause and for the next 4 decades advocated for eliminating national origin as a basis for immigration restriction. We cannot draw distinctions between people based on the countries they come from and the fact that countries are comprised of peoples and countries are the way they are because of the people that live in them, so we can tell which peoples are more or less likely to be compatible with our country by looking at their country. So, thanks to the likes of Emanuel Seller, Dearborn, Michigan, and Minneapolis, Minnesota are now little Mogadishus, or Islamic caliphates. My Jewish learning writes, at no time were his efforts more critical in the 1930s when the US, England, and France, among others, proved unable or unwilling to open their doors to victims of Nazi persecution. During World War II, a rabbi came to his home on the Sabbath, and the rabbi said to him, "Don't you see, can't you see, won't you see there are millions being killed, can't we save some of them? Can't you, Mr. Congressman, do something?" Seller equivocated, averring that President Roosevelt had told him that he sympathized with the Jewish plight but could not divert ships being used to transport war materiel and soldiers to bring in refugees. The rabbi's reply moved Seller to tears. If 6 million cattle had been slaughtered, there would have been greater interest. So, it was the suffering of the Jewish people and Seller's Jewish identity that drove his anti-immigration restriction efforts throughout his time in Congress, the second longest congressional career in American history. After the war, as chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Seller resolved to liberalize immigration law. In 1946, Congress so restricted the number of displaced persons who could enter the US that despite the starvation in Europe, fewer than 30,000 displaced persons immigrated. Seller's determination efforts led to the passage in 1948 of a bill which allowed 339 displaced persons, many of whom were Jewish, to enter the country. In 1965, President Johnson signed into law an act that eliminated national origins as a consideration for immigration, culminating in Seller's 41-year fight to overcome discrimination against Eastern European Jews and Catholics. So, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the 1965 Immigration Act all happened within 2 years of one another and were driven by Jewish civil rights activists and Jewish Congressman Emanuel Seller. As a counterexample, we do have the 1990 Immigration Act, signed by George Herbert Walker Bush into law and presented by Senator Ted Kennedy. And yes, Ted Kennedy may not be the best example of a practicing Catholic given the wife that drowned in his Oldsmobile in a lake, but there's still people who wear the Catholic identity like a skin suit who use it to advance progressive immigration causes in America. Just as the Open Society Foundation, George Soros's global governance foundation that sponsors progressive NGOs in America, elects liberal district attorneys and candidates in American cities to liberalize criminal justice laws and leads to the murder of the likes of Iriana Zarutska in North Carolina, but also funds caravans to surge the southern border and flood it with millions of illegal migrants. Just as Open Society Foundation funds that, there are also a number of Catholic charities who are working with the Biden administration to, for example, bring illegal immigrants into Arizona and pay for their charter flights all across the country to just disperse them across red states to try to demographically gerrymander elections in favor of Democrats. So there are Catholic organizations and congressmen and presidents, it turns out, that have done this too. The most famous president to have done this is John F. Kennedy, who came up with the term a nation of immigrants. He came up with that term in a book, in an essay that was elaborated into a book for the Anti-Defamation League. So a Catholic president works with a Jewish advocacy organization to rewrite the history of America to be a nation of immigrants, to argue for more immigration. The lie that America is a nation of immigrants was invented by the ADL and is still being spread today. This was in 2019. The original book, A Nation of Immigrants, was reprinted as a 60th anniversary edition in 2018, and it is being used to yet again complain about the Trump administration's position on deporting illegal immigrants and restricting immigration from incompatible nations on its immigration red list, its Muslim travel ban list. And they're still trying this line, by the way, even when the Trump administration has made concessions on supporting H-1B visas, still having mass third world migration, and Kristi Noem saying they are rubber stamping citizenship grants at a record rate, which nobody in MAGA voted for. So they're still buying this progressive line from advocacy organizations like the ADL that says the settlers of America are no different to modern-day migrants from Somalia. And if you try to tell the difference, you're a racist, and specifically, you're an anti-Semite, because that mentality kept Jews out during World War II when they were fleeing the Holocaust. It's a guilt trip that shouldn't work, but has still a very powerful hold in the post-war mindset over lots of Americans, especially boomer politicians. Now, this has been imported to Britain by Barbara Roche, who, yes, was Jewish. Now, Tony Blair is just as guilty of this. He converted to Catholicism, but given he supports abortion and mass migration, I wouldn't say he's an authentic Catholic. And Andrew Nether, who I believe is an Englishman, said that when he was writing speeches for Roche, he got the impression that the Blair government wanted to, quote, rub the right's nose in diversity and render its arguments out of date. So this didn't come from a Jewish position, it came from a demented ideological liberal position. But it is undeniable that Barbara Roche, as a Jewish woman, imported the ADL's Nation of Immigrants narrative from America, which isn't even true about America, to Britain, and said Britain is a nation of immigrants. In this Civitas report, titled A Nation of Immigrants, it says, one prominent public figure who made this claim in recent years is the former Labour Minister with special responsibility for immigration, the erstwhile MP, Barbara Roche. She first did so in September in 2000 in a speech at the Conference on the Future of Labour Migration to the UK, organised by the Institute for Public Policy Research, Blair's favourite think tank. In her speech, the then junior minister argued that Britain should adopt towards immigration a more relaxed approach than it had done in recent times, since there was a need to facilitate the entry of more foreign workers. They were alleged to be needed partly to redress the country's ageing workforce and partly to meet reputed labour shortages in a range of jobs, from information technology through reading and nursing to catering and agriculture. Roche concluded her speech by saying that, quote, this country is a country of migrants and we should celebrate the multicultural, multiracial nature of our society and the very positive benefits that migration throughout the centuries has brought. Roche repeated this claim in a contribution she made to a Home Office research paper published in 2001 under the title Migration, an Economic and Social Analysis. There, after claiming the country had always benefited from its immigrants because their self-selection meant that they were, quote, more resourceful, entrepreneurial and ambitious than the norm, insulting UK natives, she went on to state that, quote, the UK is a nation of immigrants. Elsewhere in this report, it is claimed that Britain is a country of immigration and emigration, and the British population is now, as it has always been, the result of successful influxes of migrants. Roche further repeated the claim in an article entitled Beat the Backlash, published in Progress in 2004. In this article, Roche identified and suggested responses to several challenges facing those like her who favoured the more relaxed approach towards immigration that had by then become official government policy. One such challenge, claimed Roche, was, quote, to embrace our past as a nation of immigrants. History should not all be about kings and queens, dates and battles, but should look at how immigration is firmly intertwined with any notion of what it is to be British, completely rewriting the settled British, indigenous, ethnic and cultural identity to include herself as the abstract category of immigrant, to therefore import more immigrants regardless of their culture and compatibility with our identity. And so the nation of immigrant narrative that demanded that Americans deny their own heritage was exported to Britain, and the disastrous products of multiculturalism and mass migration have resulted, where now, any time a foreign criminal commits a heinous crime, the British state demands that because they have British paperwork, we can't see any difference between us and them, therefore we can't solve the problem by simply deporting them and restricting entry to our country for any of their countrymen going forward. In arriving at her view, the report writes, it is possible the erstwhile minister had been influenced by a 1996 publication of the Commission of the Racial Equality called Roots of the Future, Ethnic Diversity in the Making of Britain. This publication was no less adamant than Roche in claiming ethnic diversity to be nothing new to Britain. Quote, people with different histories, cultures, beliefs and languages have been coming here since the beginning of recorded time. Logically, therefore, everyone who lives in Britain today is either an immigrant or the descendant of an immigrant. Ah yes, the out of Africa thesis, which probably isn't even true. A similar claim has recently been made in A History of Immigration to this Country, published in 2004, under the title, quote, Bloody Foreigners, The Story of Immigration to Britain. At the very beginning of the book, its author, Robert Winder, informs his readers that, quote, we are all immigrants, it simply depends how far back you go. Shortly afterwards, he explains what he meant by making this claim by remarking, quote, ever since the first Jute, the first Saxon, the first Roman, and the first Dane leaped off the boats and planted their feet on British mud, we have been a mongrel nation. But also, we're Celts and Britons, so there is an indigenous British people, and that immigrant population from northwest Europe and the Mediterranean did not demographically replace the native population, they rather mixed in over time. And so, that's why between 1066 and 1945, we had upwards of 99% white British demographics, upwards of 90% were the same genetic stock, and the Norman conquest only left a 5% genetic impression that can be traced back today on the demographics of Britain. So even if you're counting the Normans and the Viking invasions as waves of immigrants, which has interesting implications for the intentions of the current waves of immigration, if you're counting invasions as immigration, but even if you're counting that, they had a infinitesimal demographic footprint on the 1,000-year-long uninterrupted history of our country. It's only since 1948, with the Windrush generation, that we have been rewritten to be a nation of immigrants as if Windrush was our Mayflower. And it has been done by a liberal Jewish Home Office minister in the early 2000s when Blair wanted to rub the right's nose in diversity and render its arguments out of date. Winder's book has a curious thesis. In this article reviewing it, in 2017, it says, Robert Winder has a thing about the year 1290. His groundbreaking 2004 book on immigration to Britain, Bloody Foreigners, has a harrowing centerpiece. Edward I's expulsion of the Jews. This included the story of how one of the boats carrying the refugees struck a sandbank, whereupon the captain invited his passengers to get off and stretch their legs. He then sailed gleefully away, shouting that Moses would save them and left them to drown. So, for some reason, British people have an ancestral blood guilt because of how some English people treated the Jews in the 13th century. But speaking of my ancestors, this report has a fascinating finding. It turns out that Jewish immigration to Britain does have a long history here, and it is intertwined with the history of migration, at the very least. And if we're using the Norman conquest to justify the mass migration of the present, I mean, strange argument. But if we're using that standard and we're exploring the presence of Jews in progressive movements, and we're counting mass migration as one of them, this Civitas report does point out that in addition to the various political, military, and religious changes that William I made to the structure and organisation of English society after the Norman conquest, primarily to consolidate his power over the country, he also made several commercial and economic innovations no less profound or long-lasting. To finance his military campaign, as well as reward those who had helped him gain the country, William was in need of liquid funds. They were needed, not least, to pay those who had supplied him with the fleet on which he had transported his invading army to England. To obtain these funds, William turned for credit to several Jewish financiers resident in Normandy, in France. These were members of an ethnic minority in Europe who had already begun to acquire a degree of expertise and acumen in the field of finance, so many other avenues of endeavour having been officially closed off to them. Along with his soldiers, William brought over a small number of these Jewish financiers. They initially took up residence in London, subsequently being joined there by spouses and children. Later, these Jewish financiers and their families, together with others from Normandy, spread throughout England, establishing small communities in nearly every major commercial centre. Even so, their overall numbers were small, amounting to no more than an estimated total of between 5,000 and 6,000. Until they were expelled from the country at the end of the 13th century, the Jews who settled in England, in the wake of the Norman conquest, fell there under the direct protection of the king, not that of any local magnate. As well as financing royal activities, they began in time to extend credit to several other prominent figures, among whom were several Norman bishops, the construction of whose cathedrals in England, Jewish capital, helped to finance. Initially, these Jewish immigrants from Normandy enjoyed friendly relations with the king, church, and nobility. However, Their relations with others in England started to deteriorate soon after the beginning of the 13th century, after some Anglo-Norman nobles, including Simon de Montfort, had become heavily indebted to and hence resentful of them. A succession of ever more cash-hungry English kings found their Jewish subjects becoming less able to pay the ever more exorbitant special taxes that these kings will want to impose on them. Relations between Jew and Gentile became further strained in England during that century by several edicts promulgated by successive Lateran councils, of which one required all Jews domiciled anywhere within Christendom to wear distinguishing insignia on their apparel to make their ethnic identity apparent to all. Additionally, stories began to circulate in England, occasionally provoking minor pogroms there, that Jews practiced periodic ritual slaughter of Gentile children to procure blood for use in Jewish foodstuffs. Such stories did little to enhance the popularity among the local population. Edward I made a half-hearted attempt to regularize their settlement by opening other trades up to them besides money lending, after his father Henry had forbidden Jews from engaging in it. This attempt to regularize the settlement of Jews in England was always destined to fail, since the opportunities for work in England offered to them remained hidebound and severely restricted. By the time it became clear to Edward that his attempt at regularising the settlement in England had failed, the Jews had become so impoverished as to be of little use to the exchequer. Accordingly, in 1290, they were summarily ordered to leave the country. While the 13th century historian Matthew Paris claimed as many as 16,000 Jews left England in that year as a result of the order, more recent scholars estimate their number at the time of their leaving to have been no more than between 2,000 and 4,000. So there might be an element of resentment for expulsions from England and Europe, as we mentioned before, that drives the insistence on mass migration to Europe, not just the insistence that Jews are a persecuted minority, and so in order to prevent the persecution of Jews, to prevent them from standing out, no one can have their own distinct identity. We are all fundamentally equal, and the law must protect minorities from majorities. But also perhaps some vindictive Jewish people, again, definitely not all, and this is purely theoretical, but some vindictive Jewish people despise the Catholic Church, they despise Europe, and so they enjoy, in a kind of sadistic or schadenfreudish way, the treatment of Europeans at the hands of new migrants from the Middle East and Africa. And I would hate for that to be the case, and I know there are lots of Jews that express their horror about what's happening in Britain right now and the fact that it's basically turning into a Muslim state, but perhaps not all Jews share that horror, and it certainly seems that the Jews that are indifferent to that horror and have been promoting mass migration and multiculturalism have been the dominant Jews in politics in both Britain and America. So the nationalist Jews that basically want England and America to enjoy the same standard of national identity that Israel has haven't been as outspoken. They certainly haven't spoken about it in those terms, and they haven't challenged their liberal Jewish counterparts, and I encourage that they do. Years on, Roche remains committed to the mass migration narrative because she founded the Migration Museum, and in an article explaining why she did so, she said, "As a youngster from a Jewish background growing up in East London, I wanted to know how my story fitted into the national picture." Very ethno-narcissistic of her. Like many others, I came to understand that my family history reflected the way generation after generation of people have moved to and from Britain over the centuries. In fact, even though I thought that I knew my own family history, a cousin of mine recently made the tragic discovery there are branches of my family on the Sephardi side who were murdered in the concentration camps during the Holocaust. I first made the case for a migration museum for Britain almost 20 years ago, an idea that stemmed from my time as Britain's immigration minister and from visiting similar museums in other parts of the world, notably Ellis Island in New York. So there's this identification with the global Jewish diaspora as an oppressed people who need to make their identity protected and prominent in national politics outside of Israel. And this is why they're currently building a Holocaust memorial right next to Parliament, even though we have Holocaust memorials in Britain, and Britain was part of the side that stopped the Holocaust. Like, we went to war, we lost thousands of lives to defeat the Nazis, but we are still beating ourselves with the stick of inexpungible historical guilt, as if all Europeans are guilty for the persecution of Jews across history. If we're against blood libels, if we're against ancestral guilt, which I think we should be, then we shouldn't accept this ancestral guilt either. It's unfair. Roche wrote, "As I began to explore the idea more, I realised I was far from being alone in passionately believing that Britain's migration history should be placed at the heart of our national story. No. I think the British people, the indigenous English, Welsh, Scottish and Irish, their kings and queens, their laws, their lords, their great feats of adventurism should be placed at the heart of our national story, not the marginal figures who have contributed questionable things to Britain's history and have inserted themselves in such a way that calls for us to redefine our identity and deny that our ancestors even existed. There have been other influential Jewish politicians throughout British history. On the Conservative side, you've got Benjamin Disraeli. In the House of Lords, you had Lord Rothschild, who was involved in the Zionist project. But the most influential leftist Jewish politician was Sidney Silverman, who was an anti-fascist and involved in the abolition of the death penalty despite its popularity and continued support among the British public. Silverman, like Starmer, was an atheist, a socialist, and a lawyer. Starmer himself is not Jewish, but he is married to a Jewish woman and raising his children as Jewish. And Silverman defended, in October 1937, a man who had thrown a brick that knocked Oswald Mosley unconscious at a British Union of Fascists demonstration in Waltham. During the Second World War, when Silverman was a member of Parliament, as reports of the Nazi extermination of Jews in Eastern Europe became a horrifying reality, Silverman endeavoured to form a committee to organise Jewish refugee resettlement. He was also part of a parliamentary delegation to the Buchenwald camp after the Allied victory, and that winter was an observer at the Nuremberg trials. So the horrors of the Holocaust informed his legal advocacy and his legislation while in Parliament. And this is why, despite Eichmann's execution for being a Nazi war criminal, Silverman continued to campaign for the abolition of the death penalty. In 1948, he advanced a criminal justice bill, and he was arguing that the government should then abolish the death penalty under the post-war Labour government, but it didn't happen. It wasn't until 1965, under Harold Wilson's government, that the Death Penalty Abolition Act was given royal assent in November. And this conflicted at the time with Ian Brady and Myra Hindley being found guilty of the Moors murders, and then being the first high-profile case to escape the death penalty, which would have been just, and instead giving them life in prison, causing public outrage. So Silverman set himself against prevailing public opinion, and that public opinion persists to this day, with support for the death penalty for child abusers and terrorists remaining in the 50s and 60s% when the public polled. But to this day, only one politician, which is Rupert Lowe, has advocated for at least a debate on returning the death penalty to Parliament, and that's because of the lasting legacy of Silverman's Act, and of Keir Starmer's international legal advocacy abolishing the death penalty overseas, fighting on behalf of Jamaican murderers to get off without facing the harshest possible punishment for their heinous crimes. This is bipartisan too. This is an article I've covered by Conservative Lord Danny Finkelstein, who wrote in August 2025, "There's no future in the politics of victimhood," saying that whites in England shouldn't complain about mass migration and say that they are the victims of anti-white racism and mistreatment by the government because they're playing the victim, even though that is the direct source of moral justification for the existence of Israel, that they were persecuted by pogroms and the Holocaust in the 20th century, and so they need a state to protect their own people, which I think is a fair justification. So I just want for the English what Israel has, a state that acts in the interest of my own people. But Finkelstein has said about his own wavering opposition to migration. He says, "For more than a quarter of a century in active politics and in this column, I've been warning against allowing mass migration into the UK. My concern was less the numbers than the speed." So he doesn't object to the number of people moving here, just the efficient way in which Britain can become a multicultural, multi-ethnic country, while Israel remains an ethno-state. He says, "Let us welcome people, but not a huge and rapid movement that has allowed little or no time for integration. It was, I argued, a reckless policy we would come to regret. It was an uncomfortable position at times, not least because I am the son of refugees and keenly aware of the impact of saying no to people who want to come here. Because his family fled Stalin and Hitler, he's written compellingly about this. He said, but I held fast nonetheless. My family has been here safe precisely because of British culture. We want to be a part of it. I hope we've enriched it, but I would never wish to either ignore it or erase it." But, Danny, if you're still arguing for mass migration and multiculturalism with the accommodation of foreign cultures into a British identity, rather than saying that the ethnic people indigenous to the land have a right to collectively organise and make politics in their interest, then you haven't enriched it. You've only attempted to erase our identity in order to put yours on the same level playing field, because you identify as the son of refugees, and so you identify as an oppressed minority and end up advancing liberal politics while pretending to be a conservative. So this diaspora mentality of being a persecuted minority, of facing expulsions and exile all throughout history, has driven some Jewish people, even if they're not outright progressives, to cede ground to progressive narratives that then give progressive policies on immigration or the sexual revolution or civil rights ascension. This is still a problem now, by the way. Lord Richard Hermer, who is the Attorney General responsible for throwing people in prison after Southport for hate speech crimes, was himself a member of the Union of Jewish Students. He seems to staple his Jewish identity to all of his socialist legal activism. Laurie Rostel has written for the Daily Skeptic here, and again, this is part owned by Lord Toby Young of Acton, who himself is a proud Zionist, so this is not an anti-Semitic observation. This is the newspaper clipping of Lord Hermer speaking in Blackpool for the Union of Jewish Students. Laurie Rostel writes, Hermer's youthful far less politics is apparently not something he wants widely known. In a recent interview with the House magazine, he details his career in student politics as chair of the Students' Union and a national executive member of the National Union of Students, but omits entirely his association with Searchlight. Searchlight was the anti-fascist magazine that got high off the stories of fighting Oswald Mosley at Cable Street, that then became Hope Not Hate, because Nick Lowles, the CEO of Hope Not Hate, worked at Searchlight around the same time as Lord Hermer, and then broke off to found Hope Not Hate. As the below clipping from Searchlight magazine shows, he might not have achieved his National Union of Students role were it not for being a Searchlight member and Searchlight campaigning on his behalf. The Daily Skeptic has seen documents that show that Hermer's involvement in Searchlight continued long after his student days, well into his career as a lawyer. So much so that in 1996, 3 years after being called to the bar, Hermer was being recommended to join the magazine's management committee. The man who put his name forward was Jerry Cable, Searchlight's long-serving editor, who once stood for election for the Communist Party and in the 1980s produced research for a BBC Panorama documentary that falsely alleged that 2 Conservative Party members were secret Nazis, after which the BBC lost a libel trial and had to pay damages. Later minutes show Hermer missing a meeting in June 1999 and attending one in November that year, alongside Nick Lowles, who was co-editor and then editor of Searchlight between 1999, 2011, and in 2004 founded Hope Not Hate. Now, this is not the only prominent advocate of Jewish identity politics who is a member of Hope Not Hate. This is Ruth Anderson, the Baroness of Stoke-on-Trent, who has faced a lot of anti-Semitism during her time in the Labour Party under the Corbyn years, so, we empathise with her suffering this kind of abuse. But Ruth has an interesting career history. She worked in PR roles for the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre. She was then parliamentary chair of the Jewish Labour Movement in April 2019 and served until she lost her contest for the Stoke constituency of December of that year as an MP. She was then given a life peerage on the 18th of November 2022 and is currently a member of the House of Lords. And Ruth, from 2010 to 2015, was the Deputy Director of Hope Not Hate. She's also been employed by the Community Security Trust and worked for the Board of Deputies of British Jews. So she works for prominent Jewish organisations and also communist advocacy organisation Hope Not Hate. So the curious question then is, why does Ruth Smeeth have intelligence connections? I mean, this is according to a WikiLeaks cable, where an American communique sent from the US Embassy on the 24th of April 2009 cited Ruth Smeeth as the source for why Gordon Brown had planned to go to the country after Labour had received a momentary jump in the opinion polls after the G20 summit in London, and it was called off after Damien McBride had sent emails to Labour aides containing unfounded allegations about the personal lives of senior Tories, and he was forced to resign. The intelligence about the election came allegedly from Ruth Smeeth, the Labour candidate for Burton at the last election. So she wasn't particularly significant. She wasn't an MP. She wasn't a baroness by that point. But American diplomats in London took Smeeth seriously, as her name was followed by a recommendation to strictly protect her identity. The cable said, perhaps most damaging of all, however, Smeargate effectively ended what may have been Brown's plan to call a general election this spring, based on the rise in polls he received following his solid performance at the G20. Ruth Smeeth, strictly protect, told us April 20 that Brown had intended to announce the elections on May 12th and hold them after a very short matter of weeks campaign season. So, are there other intelligence connections that Hope Not Hate might have? Well, Harry Schuckman, who now has a book deal with Penguin for some reason, who was the protagonist of Hope Not Hate's 2024 documentary Undercover Exposing the Far Right, used a fake passport to entrap subjects of that documentary, and they weren't under police investigation. They were just duped when he posed as his alias Christopher Charles Morton with the following passport image, of which details I have redacted in case that they have any correspondence with an actual passport that someone owns. How did he get this fake passport? Was it either with a convincing forger and I referred this to the police multiple times, and my police reports went missing. When I called for a follow-up, I was told they didn't exist in the system. The Spectator, under John Power, had reported on this, and then the Spectator have now withdrawn the article for some reason. So, did he procure it via a criminal enterprise that would violate the Identity Documents Act of 2010, which then doesn't explain why the police have no interest in it? Or was it procured with the assistance of a government agency or intelligence service? Now, is there any evidence that Harry Schuckman has any connection to the intelligence services? Well, according to the CV that he provided a source that gave me the passport photo, his alias graduated from University of Manchester in 2013, but that doesn't exist. Instead, Schuckman graduated with an undergraduate degree from the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Cambridge and an MA in Terrorism, Security and Society from King's College London. As lots of people would say, he glows like a worm. If there were ever a academic and journalistic career that would make him a target for being an asset of intelligence agencies, it's definitely that one. And what's curious is his father, David Schuckman, who was employed at the BBC for 38 years from 1983 to 2021, accidentally embroiled the BBC in a scandal in 2002 while he was their diplomatic correspondent, when he inaccurately alleged that a shareholder in a Congolese diamond mine owned by Oryx Natural Resources was the same individual as an Al-Qaeda associate who was jailed for his involvement in the 1998 bombing of US embassies in Africa. Oryx then sued the BBC and the case was settled for about £500,000. But in a report to The Guardian, David says that his source was from MI6. So at least his father, while a BBC journalist, had open lines of dialogue with the intelligence services. And his grandfather also has connections with MI6 because he was a spy. He was an Oxford University graduate, according to his Wikipedia page, who was born in London to Jewish immigrants who fled Tsarist Russia, who then developed a lifelong fixation with communism, writing his PhD thesis at Oxford on the Polish Socialist Party, the Jewish Labour Bund, and then publishing and translating numerous books on Soviet communism. His son, which is David's brother, Henry Schuckman, Harry's uncle, wrote a book about his father called One Blade of Grass, and it says, "My father, a historian in Russian studies at Oxford University, was offered a fellowship in Helsinki and took his family with him. From Helsinki, Russia was less than a day away by boat across the Gulf of Finland. It was the Cold War, and when a message came through from Cambridge Circus that my father was to travel to Leningrad on urgent business, he didn't hesitate. Although he was a quiet Oxford man, like many Russianists at the time, he also did the occasional work for Circus, namely MI6. He was a part-time spy. Mum and Dad went together. They disappeared across the water into the Soviet wastes, leaving the kids in the care of a Finnish au pair. So Harry Schuckman has family connections to MI6. He has the ability to forge convincing documents to entrap members of the far right in sting operations that attempt to ruin their reputation publicly. Ruth Smeeth, who is a baroness on the board of Hope Not Hate, is named in American communiques as a source to strictly protect, and Lord Hermer, a long-time ally of Hope Not Hate, is one of the most senior members of the government. So the idea that the likes of Hope Not Hate don't have powerful connections protecting them from when they may have broken the law, for example, Harry Schuckman's passport, or Nick Lowell's spreading false information about acid attacks during last summer riots, well, there's reason to be suspicious there. Why am I mentioning all of this in this video? Because Harry Schuckman, in the documentary, had an extended explanation of why he is involved in anti-fascist politics, in Hope Not Hate, and he cited the persecution of his ancestors, especially during the Holocaust, as the reason for why he involved himself in communist politics. So the reason I'm raising this is to say it's not just a pattern in America that Batya Ungar has highlighted, it's also the case across diasporas, across the West, across the Anglosphere, in England and in Europe. And so these unwanted progressive political revolutions against the wishes of the majority population by organised minority groups, including many Jewish people, have led to a scepticism of Jewish people in Western politics. And this is loudest in America at the moment, but it's going to come to the UK too. And I think Jews who I've met who are concerned about this and who do not share the politics of Harry Schuckman and Ruth Smeeth and the progressives in the civil rights movement and the feminists and Barbara Roche and all of these people, I think those people need to speak out. They need to involve themselves in the Jewish organizations that do claim to speak for the global Jewish community, like the Board of Deputies or the World Jewish Leadership organization, and they need to table these issues and ensure that said progressive Jews don't get to run the show anymore. Otherwise, it's going to lead to a collective judgment of Jewish people, and things could get genuinely quite ugly, and nobody wants to see that. Nobody wants to see people treated unjustly on the basis of their race. Now, what are some of the other explanations for this? Well, the reason that I read out that long passage from the Civitas report on the Norman Conquest is not just because it's interesting history, but because it shows that throughout history, no matter what the ideology or the ruling power is, there have been wealthy Jewish groups who have allied themselves with the ruling power in order to court favour with power to protect themselves as a minority group in a foreign land. And that just makes sense. It's the interest of any people who want to prioritise their long-term security, especially when they are not the ruling power of a place. You organise and bargain for your collective interests. It's the source of resentment at the moment to Jewish groups that white people can't do the same thing. So that's a double standard that I don't think can be sustained, actually, and is the reason why Nick Fuentes is so popular, because he's pointing out that double standard, and there's something that needs to be recognised and addressed by Jewish groups. But I asked why this might be, and so I asked some Jewish friends of mine, and I'm just going to share some insights here that they wrote down anonymously, and I thought I'd relate to you. One said, don't underestimate the extent to which a lack of emphasis placed on heaven, hell, and the afterlife in Jewish scripture encourages Jews to therefore try and manifest a utopia on earth, to basically make the world ready for the return of the Messiah, when some Jews believe the Messiah will come back and reinstate all the powers that man had in the Garden of Eden before the fall to mankind. Because some Jews believe that Adam basically had telepathy and telekinesis and things like that. It's not a view that Christians hold, so it's very alien to us, and it's kind of hard to wrap our head around it. But Christianity placed a lot of premium on the afterlife because of the Hellenic influences on Christian philosophy. Think of the early church fathers like Augustine and Aquinas, who could be neatly sorted into the boxes of either preferring Plato or Aristotle. There was that lively debate about Hellenic philosophy in the early church fathers. Judaism doesn't have any of that. Instead, it's actually a lot more materialistic. And this strain of sort of perfecting the human infected some Jewish movements, like, for example, Soviet communism. If you read the works of Leon Trotsky, who himself was ethnically Jewish, he believed that when communism came about, when the false consciousness of man fell away with the egalitarian redistribution of all material resources, then man could, by thought, re-engineer his biology to improve his digestion, improve his cognition. This is the idea of the Soviet new man. It comes from the idea of a perfectal man in Judaism, even though these people weren't religious Jews. This religious Jew was explaining to me that it's basically a transferable mindset, that if you remove religion from Judaism, you still have that impulse for utopianism, just like you have that mindset of being a persecuted minority in Egypt and Europe, being exiled and wandering the world without a state for many years, so you need to seek security for your diaspora when you're in foreign lands. This was an insight that was shared with me by Jews when I went to Israel and was asking some of these very uncomfortable questions while I was there. A couple of Jewish people on the trip explained that essentially that liberals, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, have pushed a liquidation of distinct identities into a milieu of grey goo, leading ironically to importing anti-Semitism from the Muslim world. One Israeli explained there is a Hebrew phrase for this. I can't speak Hebrew, but it translates to defending oneself to death. Fearing persecution, some Jews have treated the peoples most likely to protect them like their enemies, Christian Europeans. Interventions by right-wing Jews who reject this denial of ethnic identity and self-determination for European peoples are most welcome. Jews are not protected by international laws and abstract egalitarian principles, but by relationships with strong, self-conscious majorities who befriend them. The Christian Europeans and Americans who should be put first in their own homelands, who might be more favourable to Jews if they form relationships with them as peoples, rather than being treated as oppressive majorities who are to be regarded with suspicion in their own countries. Anglos and Europeans are impaired by a post-World War II guilt complex when arguing for our own countries on our own terms. Within the liberal paradigm, a nation can only justify its existence by prioritising minorities over majorities. Preventing anti-Semitism is prioritised over the well-being of majorities, and often incoherently paired with preventing Islamophobia, racism, and discrimination against the leftist coalition, like the civil rights movement, like feminism, or
like the Board of Deputies complaining about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the same breath. As one Israeli explained to me, quote, "It's easier for Jews to link up with the intersectional rainbow because they see themselves as a minority. In Israel, the majority asks, how do we rebuild this 1,000-year-old identity that is fractured in exile? In America, they think, as a minority, how do we make sure that they, whites, don't kill us?" And so that's part of the reason for the double standard, why other countries outside Israel have to be multicultural and practice international law, but Israel can reject the rulings of international law and can be an ethno-state for the Jewish people. And I'm sorry, that double standard won't last, because people can recognize it, especially in the age of social media, and they can talk about it in sober and fair ways, which I hope I've done today, citing mainly Jewish sources. Honestly, this video could completely get me cancelled, even though I'm not trying to be a dick about it. I'm actually just warning you guys, Jews who are concerned about anti-Semitism, but who aren't these demented progressive ideologues, that if this is the continued perception that Israel enjoys something that its Western nations, which are meant to support it, can't have, then all support from Israel would be withdrawn. And if that's something you guys are interested in, you might want to work on that. I'm not Jewish, either ethnically or religiously, so Israel is just another country to me. And you have to understand that at this point, that's the best you're going to hope for my generation, because lots are openly vitriolic towards it. They're not apathetic. I mean, I certainly don't appreciate the ways in which liberal Jews have pressured my politics in this way. I don't collectively blame all Jews for that, but some people are going to. And so if you guys don't address this issue, and if just by making this video I get called anti-Semitic when I think I'm being fair and I've cited all my sources, then it's not going to be good. So there are two approaches here in aligning with power, which, as we've seen with the Norman Conquest, as we've seen with the progressive revolutions, that I think Jewish diasporas have done throughout history. The current one is the post-war consensus. Liberal international institutions, multiculturalism for untrustworthy Western white nations, whereas Israel gets to be quite literally the state of exception to the post-war order. And Yoram Hazony has actually written about this in his book, Conservatism, A Rediscovery, on pages 269 to 270. And he's written a good summation of what the post-war consensus has done to confuse the identity of American and European peoples. Yoram writes, although one can see signs of what was coming earlier in the 20th century, the determination of America's elites to pursue the constitutional revolution of the 1960s, civil rights and feminism, was a consequence of the Second World War and America's bitter struggle against Hitler's racialist regime. The war had imposed long years of suffering, including the deaths of over 400,000 American servicemen, but it was the torrent of film footage and photographs from the death camps, where Nazi race theories had brought about the torture and murder of millions of Jews, Gypsies, and others, that ultimately had the most enduring effect. These images scorched the minds of an entire generation, providing the unspoken fixed point around which their politics turned. Thus, while the radicalism of the 60s generation has become the stuff of legend and song, the truth is that it was their parents' generation, men and women who were already in their 20s, 30s, and 40s in 1945, who were most deeply affected by the Second World War and the Holocaust. It was their parents who turned their revulsion over Hitler's racial politics into a revolutionary political agenda for their own country, seeking to pull down the legal and social structures that still oppressed the black minority and excluded Jews and Asians from many aspects in social life and national life. The intense revulsion against the use of racial and religious categories by the Nazis and their allies was the force that brought large majorities on the US Supreme Court and in Congress to embrace Enlightenment liberalism as the sole legitimate foundation for American government, and it isn't hard to see why. After all, it is only in the geometrical abstractions of Enlightenment rationalist political theory that one can find a discussion of what human beings are, need, and deserve without any reference to their race, colour, religion, sex, or national origin. No conservative political theory, from the Bible to Burke, had ever dared to reach political conclusions stripped clean of all these considerations, but in Enlightenment liberalism, such theories had been advanced and such conclusions had been drawn, and now America was going to implement these conclusions. Both public and private institutions would henceforth operate as though none of these considerations could be relevant to ordering the public life of the nation. So, what Yoram's pointing out, as he has in his 2018 book, Virtue of Nationalism, is that there are two lessons from 1945 and the Holocaust that don't require Holocaust denial, which are that the Holocaust has become the gravity well around which all Western politics now orbits. And so the response to this has been the progressive movements of the 1960s that taught us to distrust indigenous white majorities, to protect ethnic minorities and people with unorthodox sexual appetites, to advance the complete liberation of women from constraints, and to deny any differences between people because noticing differences is the reason for the Holocaust. Or the other lesson was that sovereign nation states of the Israeli model, or England before we fought and arguably lost a lot in the Second World War, were the only way to protect its people. And so we should return to that instead, rather than advancing the progressive revolutions that our countries accommodated because of the post-war Holocaust guilt complex, which nations that fought against it and perpetrated it were afflicted with alike, and because Jews harboring the memory of the Holocaust and a history of expulsions identified as an oppressed minority, and so used politics, civil rights, advocacy, media, etc. to transgress moral taboos, in some cases revenge themselves against the white Christian population, but in most cases fight for the rights of minority groups, liquidating the identity of the majority, saying that you have no more claim over the politics of your country than the minority groups that are here, and pushing for egalitarian liberalism, multiculturalism, open borders, feminism, progressivism, the sexual revolution, as a way to prevent themselves from standing out as a diaspora and being persecuted ever again. The problem that you then have is when you take ownership of that, you make Israel and protecting Jews and preventing anti-Semitism a central fixture of politics. People are then going to talk about it, and you don't get to control the way in which people talk about it. You don't get to say that having a negative judgment of those social revolutions, of progressivism, which I have, of which many Jews belonged, as Batya was bragging about, you don't get to then say that then that should be a career-ending offence. Of course, people can talk about it in insulting, derogatory ways that attribute blood guilt to Jewish people, and I don't think I've done that. I really hope that's the way that I haven't come across. But there has to be an open and honest discussion about this, because people just don't want it. They don't want it anymore. They want to be able to talk about it, and they want to throw off the shackles of the 20th century imposed upon them by Jews and Gentiles alike. And so here's perhaps a counterexample of if Jews want to do something advantageous in politics that makes friendly relations with the host majority Christian populations, here's maybe the way they should go about it. It's from Tom Holland's book Dominion, about how Christianity is inextricable from the Western consciousness. And it's actually the story of how the concept of religion, a Protestant attempt to distinguish public and private spheres of activity, and how religious Judaism, the invention of the Orthodox versus Reformed disputes as separated out from Jews being an ethnic people, came about. And it came about because of an attempt to repeal anti-Jewish laws passed by Napoleon in the 19th century by a Jewish banker who was funding the construction of a cathedral in Cologne. So it wasn't an act of progressivism, it was actually an act of trying to encourage Christianity in the Prussian Empire. So Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia visited the building site of the cathedral in Cologne in 1842, and it had never been finished. So he declared a new cornerstone dedicated to finishing its construction on the 4th of September 1842. And the construction was then financed by Simon Oppenheim, who was a Jewish banker, awarded a lifelong honorary membership of the board. Jews were banned for Cologne for almost 400 years until 1798, following its occupation by the post-revolutionary French government, who abolished all the papal laws. There was a tension as to whether or not Jews could ever be fully recognized as Prussian citizens, as Europeans, and this had been brought about because of the French Revolution. As Tom Holland writes, the regional government pushed for full emancipation. The strained relationship between Christians and Jews, thundered Cologne's leading newspaper, can be resolved only through unconditional equalization of status. The result was deadlock. Friedrich Wilhelm, channeling the spirit of a mail-clad medieval emperor, refused to back down. Prussia, he insisted, was Christian through and through. Its monarchy, its laws, its values, all derived from Christianity. That being so, there could be no place for Jews in its administration. If they wished to become properly Prussian, they had a simple recourse: conversion. All a Jew had to do to be considered for public office was to make confession of Christianity in public acts. This was why Friedrich Wilhelm had been willing to pay a social call on Oppenheim. What was a Jew prepared to fund a cathedral, after all, if not one close to finding Christ? But the king had been deluding himself. Holland writes. Oppenheim had no intention of finding Christ. Instead, he and his family continued with their campaign. It was not long before Cologne, previously renowned as a bastion of chauvinism, was serving as a trailblazer for Jewish emancipation. In 1845, Napoleon's discriminatory legislation was definitively abolished. Time would see a sumptuous domed synagogue, designed by the architect responsible for the cathedral and funded, inevitably, by the Oppenheims, rise up as one of the great landmarks of the city. Well before its construction, though, it was evident that Friedrich Wilhelm's dreams of resurrecting a medieval model of Christianity were doomed. In 1847, one particularly waspish theologian portrayed the king as a modern-day Julian the Apostate, chasing after a world forever gone. In February 1848, the French king was deposed. By March, protests and uprisings were flaring across Germany. Slogans familiar from the time of Robespierre could be heard on the streets of Britain. The Prussian queen briefly dreaded that only the guillotine was lacking. Although, in the event, the insurrectionary mood was pacified and the tottering Prussian monarchy stabilized, concessions offered by Friedrich Wilhelm would prove enduring. His kingdom emerged from the Great Crisis of 1848 for the first time as a state with a written constitution. The vast majority of its male inhabitants were now entitled to vote for parliament. Among them, enrolled at last as equal citizens, were Prussia's Jews. Friedrich Wilhelm, appalled by the threat to the divine order he had always pledged himself to uphold, declared himself sick to the stomach. If I were not a Christian, I would take my own life. Nevertheless, as the king might justifiably have pointed out, it was not Judaism that had been emancipated, but only those that practiced it. Supporters of the Declaration of Rights had always been explicit on that score. The shackles of superstition were forged in synagogues no less than in churches. We must grant everything to Jews as individuals, but refuse them everything as a nation, was the slogan in which, in late 1789, proponents of Jewish emancipation in France had sought to reassure their fellow revolutionaries. They must form neither a political body nor an order in the state. They must be citizens individually. And so it come to pass. When the French Republic granted citizenship to Jews, it had done so on the understanding that they abandoned any sense of themselves as a people set apart. It sounds very reminiscent of the early 20th century and late 19th century American modernists of both the Protestant and the Jewish variety that Kaufman wrote about. No recognition or protection had been offered to Mosaic law. The identity of Jews as a distinct community was tolerated only to the degree that it did not interfere with the common good. Here, garlanded with the high-flown rhetoric of the Enlightenment though it may be, was a program for civic self-improvement that aimed at transforming the very essence of Judaism. Heraclitus, a millennium and more previously, had attempted something similar. The dream that Jewish distinctiveness might be subsumed into an identity the whole world could share, one in which the laws given by God to mark the Jews out from other peoples would cease to matter, reached all the way back to Paul. It's a profoundly Christian thing to want to have the Jews come to Christ. Artists in the early years of the French Revolution, commissioned to depict the Declaration of Rights, had not hesitated to represent it as a new covenant, chiseled onto stone tablets and delivered from a blaze of light. Jews could either sign up to this radiant vision, or else be banished to the storm-swept darkness. If this seemed to some Jews a very familiar kind of ultimatum, that then was because it was, that the Declaration of Rights claimed an authority for itself more universal than that of Christianity, only emphasized the degree to which, in the scale of its ambitions and scope of its presentations, it was profoundly Christian, or at least founded on Christian presumptions. The price paid by Jews for their freedom was then a real one. Citizenship required them to become a bit more Christian. This perhaps was more evident in Germany than even in France. While naturally offended by any suggestion that the Mosaic law might have been superseded by the law of Christ, they did not hesitate to promote it as compatible with the law of Prussia. The days of an independent Jewish state were long gone. In place of Israel, Jews now had Judaism. This word, Christian invention that it was one that they had never thought to use until the prospect of emancipation began to glimmer before them. Pressed by Protestant theologians to accept a status for Jewish law as something merely private and ceremonial, they were being pressed to accept something more, that they belonged not to a nation, but to a religion. Many Jews had no problem with this concept, and some indeed found it liberating. In 1845, a group of Jewish intellectuals in Berlin issued a formal appeal for Judaism that, transcending the written prescriptions of the Torah, might be transformed into a religion that corresponds with our age and the sentiments of our heart. This was the origin of the argument between Reform and Orthodox Jews, and it says, other Jews, appalled by any suggestion that the covenant revealed to Moses on Sinai might not have been definitive, condemned them as heretics. Two rival traditions, Reform and Orthodox, began to emerge. In time, the Prussian state itself would come to formalize these divisions. Jews insistent on the enduring authority of the Mosaic law would be given official license to establish themselves as a separate community. Judaism, its founder insisted, is not a religion, and yet for all that, he protested too much. Beliefs privately and passionately held were becoming the mark of Jewish as well as of Protestant congregations. Christians, it seemed, were no longer alone in bearing witness to the Reformation. And so, as we're seeing a waning away of Protestantism in politics, at least, we're seeing a growth of Catholicism among the young, and we're seeing a shift in the terms of relationships as we move away from progressivism and people start to discuss the presence of Jews in politics as Butcher has, or as Nick Fuentes' fans have, there seems to be a need to renegotiate the settlement. And now that the Jews have a nation in which Jewish identity can be protected and proudly celebrated, I think it's fair to say that other nations should enjoy the same standard that Israel has, that they shouldn't be forced to accept the double standard of being multicultural and progressive, that this is a reasonable demand that does not mean we hate Jews. And so within Israel, Jewish identity is supreme, but outside of Israel, the identities of the peoples who make up the nations who they are named after, Americans, English people, etc., and their religions are supreme. And that doesn't mean that they need to mistreat the minorities that they like and get along with, just as you don't mistreat a house guest when they come to your home. You know, we extend to them hospitality. But it also doesn't mean that you have the same demands to the heritage, the identity, and the politics of places outside of your own nation state that is established for your nation. And someone like Yoram Hazony would agree with this. I think this is a perfectly consistent standard, and it's not malicious. And I think that if you're going to convene World Jewish Leadership Summits, it's probably more fruitful to talk about that and to oppose the progressive revolutions by left-wing Jews that Butcher Unger Sargon thinks is so good, than to agonize about the second-order effects of Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson talking about these topics in perhaps an insulting way or a way that you don't like. And so I hope this was a constructive dialogue. I hope it was an informative history lesson. And I hope this doesn't get my channel cancelled. But I think it was an important video to make, and I hope it has proved insightful. I think that ultimately we shouldn't live under the long dead hand of the 20th century. We should revisit the merits of those progressive revolutions, and we shouldn't extend long-standing inherited ethnic guilt to any ethnic group or race, and that includes white people. And I think that's the way that we can all move forward in the spirit of good faith and friendship.